Awesome. Okay, so we can get started with some housekeeping things. Um, so of course we're on live stream. So I want to thank all of our sponsors so much. First, we have GCT Law Firm. They're one of Chicago's premier law firms. They made a very generous donation to our campaign, and they've been an integral part of this tournament. They are providing two judges for our final session, and we really want to thank them for all they've done for us. Then there's Exploding Kittens. They've provided a couple of their games for our high placers in the finals. They make awesome card games. If you haven't played them, they're a must try. They're awesome. So go check them out on their website. We'll have all that in the Discord later today. And finally, Rocketbook. They are the premier reusable notebook manufacturer. They make these awesome notebooks that can sync with the cloud. You can scan them into your phone, and they generously agreed to donate one of them to all of our judges. We'll be getting the forms to the judges for who are new today, later today. But yeah, they donated Rocketbooks to all of our judges, a huge prize pack to the winner. They're really awesome, so go check them out as well. Finally, I wanted to apologize for any of the drops and technical difficulties we had yesterday. We're working through this with you guys, but I want to thank all of you guys for persevering, especially our judges and presiding officers, and letting us still have an amazing tournament. With all of that said, I will now hand it over to Jimmy. Oh wait, actually one last thing. So for judges, yesterday, ballots and rankings were on the same form. Today we separated them so that you can submit your rankings before ballots are done, because we want to get the finals chamber out as soon as possible. So when this session is done, try and submit your ranks as quickly as you possibly can, and then you can spend a little more time on your ballots if you need to. So yeah, with all of that said, I'll hand it off to Jimmy now to get us some judge paradigms.
So hi everyone, I'm Jimmy. I'll be your PO for today, I guess. And let's just go and quickly do a roll call before we get started. So I'll just go by an order of your speaking code. So Zaku, if you're here, just like say something.
Here.
Thank you. Samarth Arul.
Here.
Thank you. Amal Dash.
Here.
Yeah. And then Bharath Dilip Kumar.
Hey.
Thank you. And Ben Bressett.
I'm here.
Thank you. And then Anthony McKovic.
I'm here.
Thank you. And then I think Jason said he might be late, so we'll hold off on that for now.
I'm right here, actually.
Oh, my bad. Thank you. And then Mia Krasinski.
Here.
Thank you. And then Olivia Pascarella.
Here.
Thank you. And then Umar Hussein.
Here.
All right. And then Mudin Marwaha. Is that how you say last name?
Yeah. Here.
Yeah. I pronounced everyone's last name incorrectly. Just please let me know. Yeah. Okay. And then Jillian. Is she here yet? Jillian is not here yet. Okay. Okay, and then just like double checking. Everyone knows the procedure. It's the same as yesterday, right? So at 2 minutes, I'll just give you this, and then 2:30, and then 2:55, and then once we hit 3 minutes, I'll start the 5-second countdown, and then from 3:05 to 3:15 is your grace period. At 3:15, I'll automatically mute you. And I think that's it. And for today, you guys are all senators, so congratulations on being promoted. Yes. I think that's it pretty much. So Jillian isn't here yet, so I think I'll just like message her on Discord real quick. And if she's not here by, let's see, 11:05, I think we can get started. Thanks, guys.
While we wait, would it be all right if we took splits?
Sounds good.
Awesome. So let's do minimum wage first, I guess. Anybody who's AF, could you raise your placards? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Awesome. Negs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, awesome. Pretty even. And what about the Africa bill? AFs? 1, 2, 3, 4. Negs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So a little neg heavy, I guess.
And then while we wait, I'll just quickly share the precedence and recency chart with everyone in case you guys haven't gotten it yet. So here you go. And then I guess while we wait, we can also do judge paradigms. So if you guys could just, oh, sorry, Sarah, you can finish your drink if you want. Sorry. All right. So whichever judge wants to go first, go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brayden. I did Congress for a few years when I was in high school. My paradigm is I prefer refutation and not having rehash. So just make sure that you're engaging with the other side in a meaningful and substantive way, and you're not doing just claim level refutation, but you're going deeper than that and talking about the impacts and the warranting.
Okay, I'll go next. I definitely want to emphasize.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Soph. Definitely going to emphasize what our last judge said. First, I'm Sarah Rosen. I also competed in Congress all 4 years of high school. I judged all day yesterday. I think if you made it to this level, you should at some point know what you're doing. But I'm going to go over a couple of things that I saw yesterday that I wasn't a huge fan of. First, for some reason, refutations were not happening. I'm going to make it clear if you're not refuting in a pointed and clear way, I'm not going to rank you. Second of all, if you're speaking on the affirmation, solvency is the most key aspect of your argument. If no one on the affirmation has proved solvency, every impact that you're giving me falls flat. So make sure that you have that solvent aspect. And then third, make sure that you're being emotive, that we can see your passion, which is harder to do over camera than it is in person. But good luck, guys. You're going to do great.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sophie Hussein, and like Ryan and Sarah, I also competed in Congress all 4 years, and I kind of want to echo what they said as well. In this round, we're really looking for refutation, and Sarah and I judged a lot yesterday, and we also saw that a lot of that refutation and interaction with debate really wasn't there. So try to incorporate that into what you're saying. If you're in the round and you notice things are changing, make those necessary changes to your speech, right? Because we're not in a speech event, we're in a debate event. So make sure you're truly interacting with what other people are saying.
Thank you. And with that, it's 11:05 right now, so I'll automatically move to open session at 11:05. With that, are there any motions? Senator Makovic.
Motion to open the floor for docket nominations.
There's been a motion to open the floor for docket nominations. Are there any seconds? Assuming unanimous consent, I move the floor for docket nominations. Are there any docket nominations? Senator Dalit Kumar.
I move to nominate docket A, consisting first of minimum wage, then of the bill about Africa.
All right. Are there any other docket nominations? Senator Makovic.
I present docket letter B, consisting of the bill that is known as the Africa bill, followed by the minimum wage bill.
All right. And I assume that we'll be voting on each of these dockets. So all those for docket A, please raise your placard. 5, 6. Assuming a clear majority, docket A will be our docket, consisting of minimum wage and Africa. And now we will automatically commence debate on minimum wage. We will start this bill at 11:06 a.m. And with that, are there any sponsors for this legislation? Senator Dalit Kumar, you've been recognized.
Awesome, thank you. That's Senator Dalit Kumar. My speaker code, I believe, is 120. And I know most of the judges said they're always ready, so I'll just wait like 5 seconds, then be ready to get started. Awesome, let's go. Every day, another father chooses between putting food on the table and keeping the lights on. Every day, another mother works 3 jobs to ensure that her children can dream of a better life. Today, protect those dreams, secure our future, and pass my legislation for a higher minimum wage. But before we go into solvency, let's understand the issue in the status quo. The Census Bureau explains on 17, along with time on January 25th, 2018, that the official poverty rate in 2016 in the United States was 12.7%. That's over 40.6 million Americans in poverty as a result of the inaction of this Congress. And understand that high levels of poverty in this country don't just affect those who are directly in it. It affects every single one of us as a member of a larger community. It's our parents, our friends, and our neighbors who don't make enough to provide for themselves, even though that they work a full-time job. They're still in poverty. Today's legislation fixes that. But let's understand the fundamental impact of that reality in the status quo. The Washington Post explains on May 31st, 2018, in the United States, for over 40 million citizens, life expectancy has either stagnated or decreased as a result of poverty. Today's legislation creates a better future for those Americans, ensure that they live a longer life, a more prosperous life, with better livelihoods for every single American. But let's understand the solvency in today's legislation and how we finally fix this issue, improving the lives of millions of Americans. The Bloomberg explains on November 13, 2018, that a 10% increase in the minimum wage boosted the incomes of the poorest Americans by 15%. It also cut the poverty rate by over 3%. Today's legislation helps those struggling to get by. My burden to every single negation speaker in today's round is to prove to me how giving more money to those struggling in the status quo won't decrease poverty and won't help those who really need the money right now. The fundamental impact of that is that every single one of us benefits when there's less of our neighbors that are struggling, but passing today's legislation has much more far-reaching impacts than that. The Brookings Institute explains on January 3rd, 2017, that the American government spends $1 trillion a year at the federal, state, and local levels on poverty-reducing programs. Today's legislation doesn't just improve the lives of those in poverty, it also improves the lives of every single American because we spend less money as a community helping those who need help because now they're self-sustainable. Today's legislation creates a better future for every single American. Today, stand for our poorest constituents. Stand for our youngest constituents. Stand for every single one of our constituents. And stand in the affirmation.
Thank you, Senator Dilip Kumar, for that speech of 3 minutes and 9 seconds. I now call upon 2 minutes of questioning. All questions, please rise. Representative Dosh, followed by Representative McCovey.
Hi, Senator. Can you guarantee that all the jobs that you say will be paid more will be fair after we increase the minimum wage?
We already have labor standards in this country to ensure fairness in jobs, right? So that wouldn't be an issue even if we pass this bill.
Can you guarantee that the jobs that are now being paid minimum wage won't immediately be automated after we increase it?
Okay, so that's an interesting argument, and here's what I would contend. A lot of states in this country already have a higher minimum wage than the federal level. So what today's legislation does is that it targets the few areas of this country that doesn't apply to. By doing that, we create standard labor across the country.
Okay, so will those states that have a lower minimum wage, will they increase in automation?
No, because we haven't seen that in other states across the country. If you look to examples like Seattle, they had a $15 minimum wage, but they haven't seen cuts in wages as a and cuts in jobs and moving to automation.
Are there a lot
contend absolutely not.
Thank you, Representative. Representative McCovey.
Senator Dilip Kumar. So, do you agree with me that one of the purposes of this bill is to lower the rate in which people use social welfare programs?
Yeah, I would agree, yes.
Okay, so you would agree. But do you have any substantial evidence as to whether this bill, or rather whether raising the minimum wage, would actually help low-income constituents wean off of these social welfare programs?
Absolutely. I explained the Bloomberg report that looked into what having a higher minimum wage does to poverty levels, right? If we have less
but you said poverty
country,
levels, not social welfare programs.
Reliant on poverty-reducing programs. It's just a natural link.
Okay, but I'm being more specific here on social welfare programs. I understand that social poverty programs and social welfare programs may be lower, but what I'm emphasizing here is social welfare. Do you, for example, programs like SNAP? Do you think people will wean off SNAP as a result of this bill?
Money, they won't need Americans. If we have less low-income Americans, that won't be an issue.
Okay, so you stand by the fact that.
Thank you, representatives. Seeing as I was speech in the affirmation, now I'll call upon a speech in the negation. Will all speakers please rise? Representative Arul, you have the floor.
Thank you. This is Representative Arul. My speaker code is 105. And I know the judges are ready, so all right, if anyone is not ready, just let me know. When I was younger, I wanted to be a businessman. Frankly, the idea of making lots of money, wearing nice clothes, and looking good was quite appealing to me. And although I've been told to work on the good-looking part, what this Congress needs to understand is that we serve our constituents for their benefit, and we need to understand the long-term effects of passing a legislation like today. So when Senator Dilip Kumar asks us what is the net harm of a minimum wage, we need to understand we'd be taking away economic job opportunities for so many low-income Americans who simply are vulnerable and cannot afford such a loss. Because first, this bill will lead to increases in unemployment and harm low-income workers. According to the Cato Institute on February 16th of 2017, these minimum wage laws hurt employment, especially for low-skilled young and minority workers. The problem is minimum wage increases have proven to be poor tools for fighting poverty, and people working at or near the minimum wage typically aren't primary earners, but are secondary and tertiary earners. So the problem with minimum wage working wage increases is that low-income constituents aren't even in jobs at all. So by increasing the minimum wage, we only increase the disparity and make job opportunity decrease for so many low-income Americans. And similarly, according to David Newmark in December of 2018 of the University of California, Irvine, minimum wages pose a trade-off of benefits for some versus costs for others. Minimum wages reduce job availability on a wide-scale level to low-skilled workers. So Senator Dilip Kumar asks us to explain how the minimum wage is supposed to harm an impoverished American. But looking at the facts, it would fundamentally change the job market for the worse. It would stress and strain jobs and companies to laying off their workers. And that is something we simply cannot afford, especially in a time like today, in an unprecedented crisis. But second, this bill will harm rural workers and exacerbate the urban-rural divide. According to the Mackinac Center for Public Policy on July 17, 2019, a national minimum wage would disproportionately impact small rural communities where the cost of living is low compared to urban centers where the cost of living is high. Such mandates would equally apply to low-income centers and high-income centers. So when we think about the effects of poverty, I believe Senator Dilip Kumar has his sentiments in the right place, but not the facts. Essentially, this bill is just constructing a one-size-fits-none approach across America, stifling economic growth when it's desperately needed. So while I chose to be a businessman, we need to be congresspeople and represent our constituents.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 8 seconds. I now call upon 2 minutes of question. All questioners, please rise. Representative Pasquarello, followed by Representative Hussein.
Hi, Senator. So far your point about unemployment increasing is purely hypothetical. Can you please give me an example of a state where this has happened after they increased their minimum wage?
Yeah, like the notable Seattle wage increases. Lots of people had to go out of the city to get work. That was a huge problem because the employers started laying them off or cutting their hours.
Okay, but under this legislation, we're increasing by $1 every year. So doesn't that give businesses enough time to adjust and cut costs so you don't have to lay off workers?
Not really, because it's still a drastic increase and it's like across the nation, right? So it's not going to be accounted for in places where the cost of living is lower. And for a company that simply can't afford that, many people will have to either go to urban localities or that area would simply end up being impoverished and possibly like the workers and the companies can't exist there.
Even if it's that people are going to lose their jobs, can't they still get an unemployment check that makes up for their entire pay?
Unemployment is like historically not the only way, like not the best way to sustain our economy if so many Americans are living like that.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Hussein?
Hey, Representative. So I just had a question. You proposed some pretty drastic effects of raising the minimum wage, but if we're only increasing $1 a year, don't you think that would offset these problems?
Not really, because as I said, it's like a one-size-fits-none approach, and it's going to increase the urban-rural divide, and it simply doesn't account for so many facets.
How is that a one-sided drastic approach, or a one-size-fit-all drastic approach when you're literally taking gradual increases rather than jumping straight to a $15 minimum wage like we proposed before?
In 5 years, it's pretty much infeasible that suddenly urban and rural localities will be the exact same. So like, it's really hard to say that.
Because we're making gradual increases until the year 2029. Don't you think that would be very important in helping Americans get back up on their feet after the effects of the coronavirus?
I mean, where we are right now, businesses are already suffering, and they may be suffering like effects years into the future. So I don't see how putting more strain on them basically.
So would it be that bad of a trade-off to increase by $1 a year?
Thank you, senators. Thank you, senators. And my apologies. Earlier, we forgot to start the recording, so we'll be starting it right now. But as for like the actual YouTube stream, though, you can still go back and play it, and that'll have the first cycle debate there as well. Just the file, it'll only have the second cycle and onwards. So sorry about that. I'm going to be starting the recording now, and it's starting now. And with that in mind, I now call upon a speech in the activation. All speakers, please rise. Representative Marwaha, you have the floor.
I thank the chair. This is Representative Marwaha. My speaker code is 187. I know a lot of the judges said they're already ready, so I'll just wait like 5 seconds. Awesome. Just yesterday, the United States launched the first manned mission from United States soil in almost a decade. You know what else hasn't changed in over a decade? The federal minimum wage. It's time we get with the times and finally pass today's legislation and increase the minimum wage. So first, let's address the key negation claims in this round. Senator Arul tells you that passing today's legislation would increase the price of goods and decrease employment. Let's see how both of these claims are just not true. We can justify it using past presidents. According to the Economic Policy Institute, in 2019, in a meta-analysis of 64 minimum wage studies, there was little or no evidence of a negative association between minimum wage and employment. That proves that unemployment is not actually a harm of increasing the minimum wage. We've seen it in the past, and it won't happen in the future. Next, Representative Arul tells you that gives you an example of Seattle and how unemployment, and we saw all of these net harms in Seattle. But that's just not true. As Senator Dilip Kumar tells you, in Seattle, we actually saw a net benefit, actually boosting employment and increasing the wages. This specific example that he brings up is just not true. Next, let's see how passing today's legislation doesn't increase the price of goods either. That's best explained by the Institution of Economic Research in 2019, by looking at changes in restaurant food pricing during the period of 1978 to 2015, prices rose by just 0.36% for every 10% increase in minimum wage. That means that passing today's legislation won't really have that much of an impact on the price of goods. We can't weigh these impacts that the negation brings up. Let's stick to the facts, look at these studies, and pass today's legislation. Next, we're going to pass today's legislation as Representative Dilip Kumar already tells you, it benefits minimum wage earners. But let's see how it also benefits other economic groups in America. That's because increasing the minimum wage would have a ripple effect, meaning that people who earn even higher wages would still get benefits. That's best explained by the Brookings Institute in 2018, which tells us that increasing the minimum wage results in higher wages for not just the 3.7 million people earning minimum wage, but also up to 35 million Americans who make just up to 150% of the minimum wage. An increase of just 10 cents raises the wages of 18 million people. Think about the impacts of raising the minimum wage by $7 entire dollars. Let's make the right choice, passing today's legislation helps all of the constituents that me and Senator Arul both care so much about. It's time we start working harder for the people that work so hard and finally pass today's legislation.
Thank you, Senator, for that speech of 3 minutes and 2 seconds. I now call upon 2 minutes of questioning. All questions, please rise. Senator Korsunski, followed by Senator Zhang.
Hi, Senator. So are all areas of our economy able to adjust their prices, even just that small percentage?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay, but what about our sectors that are competing within an international market, right? Like say we pass and then other countries aren't affected by this bill, how will they be able to stay competitive?
Right, so I get where you're coming from, but realize that we've seen in the past that increasing the minimum wage didn't actually have these negative effects in places like Seattle and all across America.
Sure,
So
but that was just one state. So if we implement this federally and every single state is now struggling to compete with the international market, what happens?
So Seattle is just one example. I agree, but I brought up a meta-analysis of 64 different studies. That's a lot more data than the negation is currently brought up. There's no data proving that it actually increases the price.
But they haven't been able to conduct a federal investigation, right? Because this hasn't been implemented along the federal level.
Yeah, well, obviously that data isn't available yet, but we can see from all of these different studies, 64 studies and over a study from over 40 years, that it didn't increase. That's a lot of data.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Zhang.
Senator, so you mentioned Seattle. Are there any other states that show similar correlation?
I don't have that data right now, but I definitely did see some other states.
And how do you believe that this would affect overall quality of life for individuals, especially those in the lower and the working class?
Right, so like Senator Dilip Kumar tells you, passing today's legislation improves the quality of life. He already tells you that they're gonna live a longer and prosperous life. And then I contribute to that fact by saying that it improves the quality of life for up to 150% of people living, earning over the minimum wage. That's a lot of people that we should be helping.
But do you believe that this could possibly widen the gap between the poor and the rich?
Right, so like I said, it creates a ripple effect that everyone's wages go up. So that won't actually increase the gap. Rather, everyone's earning more. 40 million Americans are earning more under passage of today's legislation. That's a net benefit.
Thank you.
Chair absorbs the rest of the time. Seeing as that was speech in the affirmation, I now call upon a speech in the negation. All speakers, please rise. Senator Korsunski, you have the floor.
I thank the chair. That's Senator Korsunski, Kor as an apple, Korsunski, speaking for the first time this session. Assuming that all my judges and PO are ready, I will begin. Low-income workers are at the bottom of the economic ladder. While the affirmation aims to help them climb further up, in reality, this legislation pulls it out from under them altogether, leaving them with no financial cushion to land on. So today, we negate, because first, higher minimum wages deal a brutal blow to local agriculture sectors. Local farms are simple and effective in providing nutritious and fresh foods for constituents, especially for those living in rural areas. But as Ivan Kandaloff, the economist from North Carolina State University, explains in 2019, small farms are particularly vulnerable to wage mandates. These operations are often already struggling with low commodity prices and rising competition from more efficient operations. Small farmers are less able to mechanize when human workers are unavailable or too expensive, and less likely than their larger peers to secure financing. A lot of companies and large players within the agriculture industry are simply able to offset paying workers more by switching to mechanization or raising prices. As Mr. Mahua on Cross answered me that every sector can raise prices, but understand that small local farmers are actually not able to bear that same burden because local farmers have higher livestock diversity and more nutritious crops grown without the intention of a long-lasting transit. But Mr. Dilip Kumar, when you are so adamant about helping large communities, understand that when local farmers are all across America are unable to keep up with the cost of production, they won't be able to continue producing the same amount of food, meaning a food shortage for the millions of people relying on a local farming for food in America, only greatening the divide that Mr. Rule is talking about between urban and rural areas. So when the affirmation wants low-income workers to climb up the economic ladder, they simultaneously undercut those who would be providing the wood. But next, increasing minimum wage would be detrimental in reducing government welfare benefits. Government welfare programs are vital because over 20% of the US population participates in government assistance every single month. But passing today could suddenly leave these millions of people with nothing. An increase in federal minimum wage would indirectly affect the federal budget by changing people's income and the prices that consumers face. As a group, the workers whose earnings increase would pay more in taxes, and receive less benefits than they would have otherwise, according to the Congressional Budget Office in July of 2019. Understand that in the affirmations world, when we pass, we actually see the opposite of their intention to help low-income Americans. As Time explains in October of 2014, many workers who get a boost in pay will see their gains offset by a reduction in government assistance that they are receiving. Why? Because eligibility for many public programs is need-based, but higher minimum wage brings things like higher premiums, and that doesn't even account for cost-sharing subsidies that are also tied to income, which is financial assistance that can be lost entirely. Mr. Dilip Kumar, allow me to be the one to answer your call for how exactly giving more money to our low-income Americans doesn't actually benefit them. Because even with such a minimal increase in pay, the government stops providing the same level of welfare, so many workers no longer receiving the benefits that they need to support themselves without providing them enough new income to cover that difference. Mr. Dilip Kumar, I echo your concern for our impoverished Americans, but understand that our most low-income Americans will be the ones that will only get plunged further into poverty if we pass. Negates today, because if American cities are going to raise the minimum wage, their goal should be to put more money in people's pockets and not just enact a policy that makes us feel good about ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator, for that speech of 3 minutes and 11 seconds. I now call upon 2 minutes of question. All questions, please rise. Representative Dilip Kumar, followed by Representative Marwaha.
Hi, Senator. So what happens to worker productivity when I give a worker more wages?
Okay, so worker productivity can increase, right? But that does not make up the difference in the large reduction that they receive in welfare benefits.
Okay, sure. I'm not talking about welfare benefits, right? With regard to your first contention, if workers are more productive, doesn't that help local agriculture?
Okay, so you'd think that yes, in the long term, higher productivity would be able to create more profit, but let's understand that they won't make it to the long term because in the very beginning, as soon as we pass, we no longer see agriculture sector able to support themselves.
Isn't that the point of the incremental increase in today's legislation? We space it out over a longer period of time so we reap long-term benefits while avoiding short-term issues.
And for some sectors that works, but unfortunately for local agriculture farmers, that doesn't avoid short-term issues. It just brings them on faster.
Why would it not be an issue if I'm doing it incrementally?
Because it already has an issue competing with big agriculture sectors and big farms, so it's already existing issues in place.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Marwaha.
Hi, Representative. So
Hi.
let's follow the last line of questioning about the local agriculture sector.
Sure.
So if it's already struggling so much by these large corporations, passing today's legislation doesn't change anything about these large corporations, right?
Passing today's legislation accelerates the rate at which our local agriculture fails.
But like Representative Dilip Kumar tells you, by increasing productivity and providing these people with a better quality of life, how is it a net harm?
Okay, these are long-term effects. As I already explained to Mr. Dilip Kumar, we won't make it to the long term when we pass.
But these short-term effects, right, they're not permanent, first of all. And second of all, this incremental thing solves for that. And
okay, it would solve for that if there wasn't already an issue, but there is already a huge disparity between big agriculture sectors and local farmers.
Right.
That's the
so
issue.
if there's already a disparity, we can't really make things much worse. So why don't we try to implement a solution that at least changes the status quo?
Well, we should implement a better solution that isn't detrimental to a specifically very important sector of our agriculture.
Okay, but
thank you, senators. Seeing as that was a speech in the negation and now call upon a speech in the affirmation, would all speakers please rise? Senator Bressett, you have the floor.
Chair, or I thank the chair. Again, that's Senator Ben Bressett speaking in the affirmation of today's legislation for the first time this legislative session, Speaker Code 128. I assume my judges are ready, so I'll go ahead and start in a few seconds, if that's all right. The United States is supposed to be the land of opportunity. But when large corporations make record-breaking profits while many American workers live below the poverty line, we must ask ourselves, who exactly is being given the opportunity to succeed in this country? Today's legislation gives this Congress the chance to extend the fundamental American promise of opportunity to all, not just those lucky enough to be born into it, which is why we passed today. But first, pass today because rural communities actually stand to benefit the most from the passage of today's legislation, because they also suffer the most under the economic status quo. Now let's start with Senators Arul and Korsunski, who tell us that today's legislation would disproportionately harm rural areas. Understand that according to a US Census report published in September of 2016, rural workers continue to benefit less from work than urban workers, with 9.8% of rural working households living in poverty, while just 6.8% of urban workers experienced poverty. Senator Marwaha has already come up here and given us a meta-analysis of 64 studies which proves that minimum wage increases have actually led to unemployment increases, but he misses a warrant for this impact, which is especially applicable to rural communities. There is a problem in the status quo. It's not that we lack workers, but that workers have no reason to work. And this is because, as Forbes tells us in September of 2013, in 35 states, welfare pays more than a minimum wage job, even after accounting for the earned income tax credit. So understand that as wages fail to keep pace with inflation, the possibility of lower labor force participation rates are real, as more people, especially in rural areas, choose the option that puts more money in their pockets, which is overwhelmingly defaulting to safety net programs. That provides a warrant for the impacts brought up by Senator Dilip Kumar, and that's ultimately why we passed today's legislation. But second, we passed today's legislation because of the intersections between minimum wage increases and decreases in violence. Now, this is seen as lower wages and social mobility are determinants of crime, and this relationship is specifically analyzed by Dr. Daniel Kim at Northeastern University, who puts things into perspective when he tells us in January of 2020 that there's a link between improved social mobility in low-income communities that are regularly faced with economic stressors like low wages and a 25% decrease in neighborhood gun homicide rates. This means that economic policies like minimum wage increases that benefit low-income Americans aren't just quantifiable in dollars and cents, they can be quantified in lives. But luckily, we have a report that does both, because according to the White House Council of Economic Advisors, in a report published in May of 2016, increasing the minimum wage to $12, just $12 by 2020 would have decreased crime by roughly 3 to 5%, translating to up to 510,000 fewer crimes over that period, as well as a net societal benefit of $8 to $17 billion as a result. It shouldn't take an impact statement to realize the transformational impact of reduced crime on our communities, which are frequently swept into a cruel cyclical relationship between poverty and crime. It's about time we give a hand, one last hand, to pull workers to sustainability, employment, and opportunity by passing.
Thank you, Senator, for that speech of 3 minutes and 6 seconds. I now call upon 2 minutes of question. All questioners, please rise. Let's see, this does go to speaking precedence. So Senator Arul, followed by Senator Makovic.
Hi, Senator. So you mentioned rural workers, that they're often jobless or impoverished. What's the reason for that?
Well, I gave you a reason in my first contention, and that's that often it's better for them to go onto welfare programs, like in 35 states where welfare pays more, than participating in the labor force. So in that sense, it's easier for them to, go onto welfare programs and receive those benefits rather than participating in the economy.
Significant portion of rural workers who just don't have a job to go to and can't travel.
Potentially that might be part of it, but again, we see that then they're forced to default on a lot of these welfare programs. And then we also have other senators in the affirmation, like Senator Dilip Kumar, who brought up increased productivity and other benefits that potentially come from passing today's legislation that could give them jobs and employment.
If we agree that they don't have jobs, wouldn't this just exacerbate?
We don't agree that they all don't have jobs. And I believe that one of the senators in the affirmation already proved with his meta-analysis of 64 different minimum wage increases that we won't see reductions in employment. That point has already been disproven. Stop bringing it up.
Thank you, Senators. Senator Makovic.
Okay, Representative, so when we talk about rural workers, can we agree that rural workers are generally more low skilled than urban workers?
Potentially, since they're working in blue collar jobs and not
white
collar jobs.
Yeah, definitely. So when Representative Arul in his speech directly states that low skilled workers' jobs will actually be reduced as a result of higher minimum wages because companies and other sources of employment will make up the difference.
Well, no, Senator Arul was talking about low skilled labor, like, teenagers, other forms of lower skilled labor that are participating in like a service-based industry. A lot of rural workers work in specialized industries like agriculture.
Labor right here. What is low skilled labor, Senator?
Okay, well, I would contend that a lot of rural workers work in specialized labor, things like agriculture, things like maintaining machinery in other industries like agriculture.
But is that low skilled workers or are those high skilled workers?
No, I mean, it's not a blue collar job, but in a sense, blue collar jobs can still be specialized. Right. And I think that Senator Arul's analysis specifically pertained to teenagers and other people who are just entering the labor force.
Thank you, Senators. Thank you. Seeing as that was a speech in the affirmation, now call upon a speech in the negation. All speakers, please rise. Senator Hussein.
I thank the chair. My name is Umar Hussein, code 181, and I believe my judges are ready. So I'll begin. The entire world sees this Congress as saviors, and that's because we can pass policies for our people. We can make our people proud, and all that happens until we actually do pass policies. We promise our people that will help them from stop living paycheck to paycheck. But we bring up legislations like this that only devastate the American people. Fail this legislation. So first, realize that if you pass this legislation, you would devastate companies and American jobs. And I know that this is something that has been brought up in this round, but allow me to connect it to modern times and see how it changes with the current coronavirus. Now, the Washington Post in December of 2019 highlights the current state of businesses. They find that United States corporations are sitting on nearly $10 trillion in debt. And what is worse is that because of the economic ramifications of the coronavirus, even the government can't bail them out anymore. In fact, the New York Times in April of 2020 finds that a new $2.2 trillion federal bailout program to help businesses amidst this pandemic actually ran out in money in just 2 weeks. Now, this is an indication that there is no hope of economic gains for these companies in this fiscal year. Now, given these statistics, the last thing we want to do is put more of a burden on them. It's no wonder that our businesses are going bankrupt every single day because they can't pay off their debt. This bill furthers their suffering by digging a deeper hole for them, because now they have to pay so much more money for a potential employee through a federal minimum wage. So the only way to survive is to lay people off. Now, Representative Arul brought up this idea, but he only made the idea of a drastic increase straight to $15. Allow me to specifically address this legislation, a gradual increase. The Congressional Budget Office in 2014 finds that at $9 an hour, economists model that 100,000 workers would lose their jobs, and at $10.10, almost 500,000 workers will lose their jobs. Now, every single year we increase the wage by $1 like this bill calls for, Americans will be exponentially losing their jobs. So Representative Marwaha, you prioritize the middle class and middle income groups, but understand that under this legislation, the low income Americans are put into unemployment, and you have to weigh those out. And Representative Brissett, you believe a $12 minimum wage would decrease crime, but tell that to the millions of unemployed Americans who have to steal to put food on their table. If we pass this legislation, it is not only a death sentence for our corporations, but for low-income Americans as well. Furthermore, fail this legislation because it would drastically increase urban poverty. And in the world with an increased minimum wage, people are going to be losing their jobs, like I just proved. Therefore, they lose their ability to pay rent and their mortgage. Beacon Economics in August of 2015 finds that if there isn't new construction of homes and more people need a place to live, supply and demand tells us that home prices are bound to rise, eating up much of the benefits of increased wages. Furthermore, as we know, homes currently aren't being constructed of the coronavirus. So therefore, homes that already exist, their prices are being skyrocketed. And as a result, people won't be able to afford them. There's a reason that cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Seattle are extremely costly places to live. They have a very high minimum wage. Pass this bill, and everybody is not only going to lose their jobs, but their homes as well, primarily from increases in rent. Economic fluctuations are very severe. Let's stop throwing money at the problem and fail this legislation.
Thank you, Senator, for that speech of 3 minutes. Senator Wu, followed by, this does go to, let's see, Senator Bressett.
Hi, Representative. So you mentioned that 100,000 people are going to lose their jobs. Can you tell me in what sectors that's going to happen?
It can be in any, pretty much, mostly like low-paying jobs such as low-skilled labor.
Okay, low-skilled labor. So what happens to these firms and companies when they have low-skilled jobs that they don't know what to do with? Do they just get rid of their workers, or are they going to outsource them or offshore them to other places?
Well, they are going to lay off many of their workers because of the increased prices.
Okay, sure. So if they lay off their workers, that labor still has to go somewhere. Does it just stay in the US or go offshore?
It's possible to go offshore.
Okay. Even if there's a small marginal risk that things go offshore, doesn't that free up work in the United States for more high-skilled, high-earning jobs for American laborers?
Outsourcing our jobs has never been a good thing. Jobs leaving in America has never been something that we wanted.
Right. Jobs are leaving, but jobs are still being freed up here. If we outsource low-wage, low-skilled jobs to foreign countries, doesn't that mean there's more high-wage, high-skilled jobs?
The whole ideology is that corporations in America cannot afford these jobs. Therefore, new jobs won't be opening up.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Bressett.
Okay, so hi, Senator. How big is the U.S. economy?
Very large.
Yeah, we have a $20 trillion annual GDP, right?
Yeah.
So don't you think that if we're seeing any potential reductions in consumer spending or any other negative economic impacts that are in the short term, if we pass today's legislation, our economy will have the ability to absorb those in the long run?
Well, you could say that, but there's a lot of different bailout programs that we've been trying. For example, like I
Right.
told you, $2.2 trillion, and that ran out in 2 weeks. You can't guarantee that just bailouts are going to work.
Right, and let's extend this coronavirus logic a bit more. And would you agree that workers are also seeing unprecedented pay cuts in the midst of this pandemic?
For sure.
And those bailouts that you referenced, one of them is a $1,200 stimulus check. Don't you think that it's good to give them a sustainable pay increase in the future so that their livelihoods can be supported after they've seen such economic devastation in the midst of this crisis?
Well, sure, the income was good, but like I'm saying, the whole ideology is that when you increase the minimum wages, you just take away jobs. Sure, you see increases in wages, but losing jobs is overall a worse thing.
Thank you.
Thank you, senators. Seeing as I was speaking the negation, I now call upon a speech in the affirmation. All speakers, please rise. Senator Wu, you stand unopposed.
I think the chair, assuming all my judges are ready, I'll just wait a couple seconds, and then Jimmy, when you're ready, just let me know. Okay. In the Midwest, there are 81,000 healthcare jobs. When the people of my state elected me to office, they did so because they knew I would protect their rights, their benefits, and their livelihoods. Now, let's move across the country and take a look at the scenarios that we face for healthcare workers across this nation working low wage, low skill, minimum paying jobs that work thousands and thousands of people every single day. Pauline Moffat, a 50-year-old direct care worker in Philadelphia, earns $9 an hour caring for immunocompromised elderly residents. Her husband was laid off as a result of COVID-19, and Pauline commutes 6 hours a day to her job. Now, Senator Dilip Kumar's legislation is not something that we can just dismissively fail. It's stories like Pauline's that should move you to pass when we previous question today's legislation. Because if not, it's workers like Pauline that will continue to struggle to make ends meet with a measly 9-hour hourly salary compensation for risking her life to sacrifice for elderly Americans. Today, I represent the great state of Illinois. In the great state of Illinois, there are 90,000 home healthcare workers that are being paid below $11 an hour. And it's because today's bill adequately compensates those healthcare workers that are currently undervalued and underappreciated that we have to pass. Now, Molly Kinder, a fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program and professor at Georgetown's School of Public Policy, writes for Brookings just 2 days ago that median wage amongst healthcare support, service, and direct care is $13.4 an hour, well short of the median pay for doctors and nurses. And for home health and personal carers, they earn a median wage of $11 an hour. There is no reason that a doctor should be paid $100 an hour and a personal care worker or an ICU housekeeper should make below $11 an hour. But there is a reason why lesser paid hospital workers or personal carers are never included on TV commercials, Instagram posts, and personal conversations that are applauding healthcare workers. And it's because this Congress continues to deem workers essential that we never recognize as that way. But the impact goes beyond the COVID-19 crisis. As Ellie Gold, a senior economist at the Economic Policy Institute, concurs with the affirmation, furthering that because the economy is entering a deep recession, workers are in a weak position to demand higher wages, much less than other benefits. The impact goes beyond the COVID-19 crisis. When we raise wages for low-income workers in the healthcare sector especially, we are both showing them that we value their work, their labor, and their sacrifice, and ensuring that they will stay in this sector after the pandemic. Now, senators, not a single person in this nation asked to be put in a global pandemic, much less fighting one on the front lines at $10 an hour with a 6-hour daily commute and one N95 mask. Now, Senator Arul is concerned about the one-size-fits-none approach, but even proponents of a regional minimum wage have argued that a minimum wage at $15 an hour is still a good idea. Not a single negation speaker has met Senator Dilip Kumar's burden to prove that there is a net harm to doing this. Even in the best case, when we implement a
Sorry, Senator, but you've elapsed the hard stop. I'm sorry about that. Now I'll call upon 2 minutes of direct question. All questioners, please rise. Representative Kwarzynski and Representative Makota.
Hi, Mr. Wu. So let's talk about the medical sector for a second, right? So if we pass, the healthcare sector has to allocate more of its money towards paying workers, right?
Sure.
Right? To increase minimum wage, they have to allocate more of their budget towards paying salaries, right?
I mean, first, I would definitely clear up something here. It's not like hospitals paying. There's also like direct care workers, personal healthcare workers, things like that. So it's not just like the industry, right?
Okay, but it's in the medical sector, right?
Yeah, the sector.
Okay.
Sure, yeah.
So right now, in the medical sector, are we at an abundance of supplies?
I mean, I think we have actually shortages of supplies.
Exactly, yeah. So why would we want to allocate this money to salaries right now when we're actually in desperate need of other more urgent things in the medical sector like masks and PPE?
Right. So there's nothing stopping us from giving more money to have more personal carers, get more PPE, get more equipment. But at the same time, we still have never shown appreciation for the work of these laborers. And that's what this bill does.
Senator McCovic.
Okay, Representative, let's focus on the medical sector when you talked about in your speech. So are hospitals businesses?
Hospitals are, I guess, businesses. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, they're for profit, exactly. So what do you think their primary goal is to do? Make money, correct?
Right, but my argument here is not strictly constrained to hospitals. There are other frontline workers, personal care workers.
Hospitals and other medical areas are just an example, Senator.
Sure.
So when we discuss raising the minimum wage, what we're really doing is eating away hospital and other medical sector profits?
I don't think so, because the hospitals.
Why don't you think so? Because if we're increasing costs of having labor, that eats away at profits.
Right now, hospitals are paying doctors, usually in metropolitan areas, $100 an hour, but they're paying personal ICU housekeepers below $10 an hour. I'm pretty sure there's room for us to pay them more.
And if we raise that, then all those workers won't have a job.
Thank you, senators. Seeing as that was a speech in the affirmation, now I'll call upon speeches in the negation. Wait. One of our judges currently has a technical issue, but I think. Wait, Sarah, do you know how long Sophie's gonna take to get back on? Like, oh, she's here. Never mind. That's perfect.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry about that, everyone. So speakers in negation. Senator Zhang, you have the floor.
Thank the chair. So my speaker code is 152. My last name is spelled Cheng. And could the judges give me a thumbs up when you're ready for me to begin? Okay. I'm not afraid of many things. Not the monster under my bed, possibly public speaking, and definitely Senator Dilip Kumar. But what I'm truly afraid of is what this legislation can do to the American people. There are heavy consequences on our constituents and the nation's future by passing this legislation, so we must negate. Personally, fail because passing this legislation would increase poverty. A study from the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland found that although low-income workers see wage increases when the minimum wage is raised, their hours and employment decline, and the combined effect of these changes is a decline in earned income. Minimum wages increase the proportion of families that are poor or near poor. As explained by George Reisman, professor of economics, when wages increase, the cost of production increases as well, resulting in smaller quantities of goods and services and the number of workers employed in producing them to the extent that some poor households also lose jobs, causing greater net losses. Senators, by passing today's legislation, we are taking a massive risk that will harm many families and putting a much larger amount of individuals into poverty. Secondly, senators, let's analyze each point that the affirmation has made today. Let's start with Senator Dilip Kumar, who argued that the poverty rate is 12.7% in 2016. But senators, the current poverty rate of 2020 is actually 12.3%. The numbers may seem minimal, but this is actually very substantial, considering the population and the communities of the United States. It's a large difference. According to the University of California, moreover, he mentioned how this legislation will help. Except, like I mentioned earlier, a minimum wage doesn't have a massive impact on the lower class. Instead, it will bring them even worse. Next, Senator Maraha mentioned that there isn't really a negative correlation between the minimum wage and employment, except according to Forbes, over 10-year intervals. Employment faces a substantial decline. Next, Senator Bresson argues a correlation between increases in minimum wages leading to a decrease of violence. Except the largest issue with this analysis is revealed by Christina Stebanovich, an individual of psychological analysis, that correlation doesn't always mean causation. Just because minimum wages are low, it doesn't guarantee that violence will increase. Next, Senator Wu argues the flaw of payments for a variety of jobs. This impact isn't fixated with the minimum wage. It's connected to the flaws of the United States economy. When it comes to how this is asked, an individual is paid. It's not a question of how. Instead, it's a question of why it's like this. Senators, the results created by the affirmation world can be compared to a cake. Whichever way you slice this cake, there will be this constant illusion for a higher wage and how beneficial it is. But we'll only be lying to ourselves. Because at the end of the day, many families, communities, and small businesses would be placed in a terrible economic situation that will end up prevailing for decades, which is why we must negate.
Thank you, Senator, for that speech of 2 minutes and 44 seconds. I now call upon 2 minutes of questioning. All questioners, please rise. This will go to questioning precedence. So, Senator Dilip Kumar and Senator Wu.
Senator, so let's take you at your word and say it's 12.3%, the poverty rate. Isn't that still 40.5 million Americans in poverty?
Yes, but it is substantially smaller.
Yeah, sure. Even then, you can't just ignore a large percentage of our population, right? Shouldn't we help them with today's legislation?
We would help them, but this legislation wouldn't necessarily guarantee that because this would be passed in 2021, and then it will only get better by 2029, I believe.
Yeah, okay. It's still incremental increases. If I have an incremental increase year over year, doesn't that increase the wages of low-income Americans in poverty?
It may, but it wouldn't necessarily be beneficial at this point in time, 2021, when we cannot be exactly certain of what's going to happen in the future.
So Senator Marwaha already explained the meta-analysis about the benefits of minimum wage. How would that not result in better wages and better livelihoods for low-income Americans?
Because of the current employment rate, and based on that current employment rate, we can't be certain. But yes, it may be beneficial, but at this point in time, not exactly.
So in the current employment rate, basically people who want a job have the least leverage. Isn't that when we should act?
Thank you, Senator Dilip Kumar. Senator Wu.
Hi, Senator. So you argue that underpayment in certain sectors comes directly from some greater economic trend or problem, but isn't paying those low-wage workers the only way to rectify or reverse that trend?
Sorry, I'm having a few internet issues. What did you say?
So you argue that the underpayment of certain sectors, workers like the healthcare industry, for example, comes from a greater economic trend or pattern in the American economy, but isn't paying them more the only way to reverse that trend?
It could, but we still cannot be exactly certain with the passage of this legislation.
We can't be certain about what?
We can't be certain that there will be a benefit.
Okay, how are the workers that are working day in and day out, risking their lives, getting paid more? Not a certainty. You're literally paying them more than the paltry wages they're getting now.
Because it goes back to that question of how and not exactly why. The United States economy isn't set on this minimum wage for specific jobs. Instead, there are some jobs that follow that, some jobs that don't. Some jobs have a set wage that may not be near the minimum wage, and based on...
Okay, so...
Yeah.
Thank you, Senator. Seeing as that was speech in the negation, now call upon a speech of the affirmation. All speakers, please rise. Senator Pascarella.
Thanks. That's Senator Pascarella. My code is 180. Just let me know when you're ready for me to begin. Or if you're not ready, probably that's easier. Cool. In 2018, Amazon was praised by media and lawmakers alike for raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour in their company. A witty corporation with a brutal work environment, known for floor workers being penalized for taking bathroom breaks, and office workers, quote, crying at their desks every day, provides better care for their workers than this Congress does. We know it's time for a change. We know it's time to reevaluate. We need to affirm this legislation. But first, let's go to the two key main arguments that were made throughout this round involving low-wage workers and the entire economy. But first, let's understand the impact this legislation has specifically on low-wage workers. I'm honestly super surprised that only two speakers in this entire round brought up the fact that we're currently in a recession, and they were both in the negation, Senators Hussain and Zhang. But understand that even when Senator Dilip Kumar and Marwana talk about how this legislation decreases poverty, even in the context of a recession, they're still absolutely right. Currently, we have around 36 million people unemployed. The vast majority of those people are low-wage workers. And so when you go to Section 1 of this legislation, you see that we start to increase our minimum wage by $1 starting in October of this year. We create a significant financial benefit for the people that are struggling the most in the midst of our recession. David Cooper, a senior economic analyst at the Economic Policy Institute, in 2019 states that raising the minimum wage by just $1 will increase the annual income of low-wage workers by nearly $1,000 every single year. But if we look ahead to 2029, when the minimum wage hits $15 every year, we're going to increase the salary annually of minimum wage workers to nearly $4,000 extra dollars. These are massive pay raises that can help us to aid the poorest people that are in our society. But understand that even when Senators Arul, Zhang, and Hussein tell us that we're going to decrease employment under this legislation, they're incorrect. Look to a Fiscal Policy Institute study from September of 2019 that states that unemployment does not grow at all when you institute a higher minimum wage. It actually, unemployment grows at a rate of 1.5% more quickly than states that have a lower minimum wage. What this means is that we actually create jobs because we foster a better economy on the whole. But next, let's understand how this legislation helps our entire economy. We need to look to a broader context of being in a recession to understand this point. Senator Karunsky tells us that we're delivering a major blow to the agriculture sector, and I understand her concern here. But if you look to the US Department of Labor, you see that just 11% of all Americans are even working in agriculture. This legislation is a vast economic benefit for every single American, especially because we are in a recession. Look to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics in 2019 that states that consumer spending drives 70% of the economy. Every $1 that we spend raising the minimum wage accounts for $10 billion in GDP decreases. That's so important because in this recession right now, we've already lost $2 to $5 trillion in our GDP. But this trickles down to our entire economy and to every different area of the United States. Because when Representative Arul tells us that we're hurting the rural economy, understand that in a recession, that problem becomes worse. Understand this helps low-income Americans and our economy.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 7 seconds. I now call upon 2 minutes of questioning. All questioners, please rise. This will go to questioning precedents. Senator Arul, Senator Christensen. Hold on. Senator Arul and Senator Hussein. My apologies.
Hi, Senator. So you mentioned how companies right now are in a precarious situation, right?
Yeah.
And do you expect that to be solved in just like 6 months? Probably.
No, obviously not, but boosting spending is one of the best ways to actually start mitigating the effects of a recession, especially in low-income demographics.
Yeah. So even if this is a gradual change, if it starts in fiscal year 2021, isn't that way too early for many companies that would still be hurting?
No, not really, because that's October, right? So it's important to start boosting spending. Obviously, the companies, they're going to have to adjust to that, but they're given a period of for sure, just a few months for them to start to adapt to that. And that's enough time for them to really adapt to that.
How is that enough time, considering we both agree that right now they already can't support jobs, they're laying off many workers? How do we even, how do we know that that's going to happen?
Because they have to start coming back eventually, and they're going to be creating massive changes to their employment as it already is. They have a diminished workforce, so with that, they have to prepare for how they're going to be paying their workers differently as well.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hussein.
Hi, thank you. So you talk about how under this legislation, it would decrease unemployment. Can you just tell me how that would happen?
Right. So when you mitigate the effects of a recession, you get job creation. You don't get job loss.
How would this mitigate the effects of a recession when it puts such a burden on these businesses who are already struggling?
Because you're not only increasing the wages of low-wage workers, but as Representative Marwana told us, we increase wages of every single American, right? And so when you have more wages, you can spend more money. That fights the.
So how does that affect these businesses who are already struggling? How would that not lead them to laying off workers?
Because they've essentially already laid off as many workers as they possibly can. At this point, what we're going to see is trends that are increasing employment as stay-at-home orders are lifted.
So I'm sure that there are many companies who are towards the brink of laying off workers. Would this legislation not push them over the edge?
No, because they're receiving stimulus checks from the government. They're receiving extra benefits to help us mitigate those impacts.
Could we really rely on just government bailouts to just carry these businesses?
Well, it's not a government bailout if we understand that we're in a recession and that they deserve that money in the first place to create an economic stimulus that benefits every American.
Thank you, Senators. Seeing as our speech in the affirmation, I'll call upon a speech in the negation. Will all speakers please rise? Senator Dash, you've been recognized.
I thank you, Chair. My name is Senator Dash, and my number is 111. Judges ready? we must listen to the voice of reason and fail. We do this for two of Senator Dilip Kumar's net harms, because this bill will impact minorities and incentivize wage theft. First, let's see how this bill will impact minorities. Senator Murwafa talked about equality, and Senator Passarella said that this bill would help reduce unemployment. But it matters to whom it reduces unemployment for. Prior to the Fair Labor Standards Act, according to the Mercatus Center in May 2019, the Black and white unemployment gap was only about 1%, negligible. After the federal minimum wage was instituted, it was twice as much for Blacks as it was for whites. You think this is just a single example? According to Forbes, on July 11th of 2016, there is no doubt an increase in the federal minimum wage contributed to a rise in a Black teen unemployment rate across America. We find that minorities are disproportionately affected by increasing minimum wage, something that no one on the affirmation has addressed. They claim equality, they claim justice, they claim a living wage, but they don't realize that not having a wage at all is worse than having a small wage. Indeed, we find that this will also incentivize wage theft. Senator Dilip Kumar wanted to talk about how this decrease unemployment in Seattle, how Seattle was a perfect example. But the reality is that many of the employments that the affirmation has talked about could constitute wage theft. According to the Yale and Policy Review in 2019, almost 2 million workers in the US are paid less than a minimum wage, classified as independent contractors, under which they do not have to be paid the federal minimum wage. As Senator Zhang said, businesses are cash strapped. And as a result, paying lower than the minimum wage becomes more and more attractive as we hike it more and more. Indeed, if you think that, fine, at least they're getting paid, the reality is that according to the New York Times on September 14th of 2015, these independent contractors are denied many of the benefits that normal workers are guaranteed, like Social Security, bargaining rights, workers' compensation. These rights are fundamental to the American worker. The affirmation has asked for a net harm, and this is it. Minorities and poor workers who need a job are disproportionately affected by this bill. This Congress is going to ignore these people, the left behind, the people riding the streets right now. We need to stand up for our constituents, stand up for the people, stand up for America, and fail this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator, for that perfectly timed speech of 2 minutes and 59 seconds. I now call upon 2 minutes of questioning. All questioners, please rise. This once again does go to questioning precedence, so that would be Senator Bressett and Senator Pascarella.
Okay, so let's talk a bit about independent contractors. Can you tell me what specific firms and sectors of the economy typically employ independent contractors?
I mean, all firms, because this is a way of getting around the minimum wage. So, for example, construction.
Isn't it mostly things like ride-sharing services, right? Like Uber, Lyft?
I mean, including them too, but there's also other businesses.
It's mostly them, right?
The most prominent example is Uber and Lyft because they're one of the biggest companies in the U.S.
Right. So do you see firms in the service-based industries like McDonald's or other like food service companies also employing independent contractors, or are they not able to do that because of the nature of the structure of labor in their firms?
I'm not sure if you could provide evidence to that extent. I don't know.
I mean, it's completely intuitive. Like aren't independent contractors generally those who work for ride-sharing firms? Like you won't go into McDonald's and see an independent contractor who's paid below minimum wage because federal law prohibits that, right?
I doubt there's 2 million workers working for Uber or Lyft. So I think there are way more industries than just those two companies.
Okay, so it's an assumption.
Thank you, senators. Senator Pascarella.
Hi, Senator. Can you agree that with or without having a minimum wage, regardless of how high that minimum wage is, employment discrimination based on race is still a problem in the U.S.?
Yes, but as we can see from my examples I provided before, once we set that original minimum wage, we can see the divide grow exponentially. Yes, okay, I understand.
That's true. Can you explain to me why that happens?
I'm not an expert in economics, but
right. But like, if you're going to tell us that this worsens racial discrimination, shouldn't there be a reason why that's going to happen?
Well, I provided you two reputable sources who say that it will.
Quantify why that happened in those examples?
I cannot justify economic theory if that's what you're asking. And
I'm asking for you to explain to me why setting a base minimum wage for every job worsens employment discrimination, because that's kind of a big claim to make without a warrant.
I mean, Why is not as much as it doesn't really matter as much as the result. The result has been proven to be that wage discrimination occurs. The why.
Thank you, Senators. Seeing as that was a speech in the negation, I now call upon a speech in the affirmation. All speakers, please rise. Senator Makovic, you have a motion?
Yeah, can I have 1 minute to finalize my speech?
There's been a motion.
Motion for 1 minute recess.
There's been a motion for a 1 minute recess. All those in favor of it, please raise your placards. Oh, yes. Assuming unanimous consent, this motion passes, and we'll come back into session at 12:09. Thank you. And I automatically call session back into order at 12:09. Senator Makovic, are you ready?
Yes.
All right, then I call upon speakers in the affirmation. Senator Makovic, you've been recognized.
This is Senator Makovic speaking for the first and final, and probably the final speaker for this bill. My speaker code is 148. I repeat, 148. At the leisure of all those above me, please give me an indication when you're ready so I may begin. Stability is commonly defined as a stable way and a calm way of living. But instability is a lack thereof. When today's Congress decides to vote on legislation, the stability of our constituents is of the greatest importance. That's why a vote in the affirmation to today's legislation brings stability directly to our people with prosperity. Now let's move on. With this bill reduces government welfare spending annually, as SNAP, Medicaid, and all lack of solvency rely too much on 100% dependency. And I want to acknowledge Representative Krasinski's claim when acknowledging social welfare programs and how they actually don't help low-income Americans. But I want to refute that, because Forbes in 2016 explains that it is a classic story of giving a man a fish or teaching him how to fish. Government welfare programs and a lot of fish, but never see them to teach themselves. As Forbes cites Representative Krasinski's claim, my economic policy institution in 2016 refutes this claim and says that raising the minimum wage to $12 per hour in 2020 would reduce means-tested public assistance by spending $17 billion annually. These savings could fund a variety of improvements to government anti-poverty tools, such as expanding the earned income tax credit to childless adults, or to provide new funding for new education initiatives, such as improving access to preschool for children from low to moderate income families. And that's because as individuals earn higher wages, they move it out of income tax brackets that allows them to receive more assistance from the government. And Representatives Hussein, Arul, and Krasinski, they all championed the inefficiency of today's legislation when regarding rural areas and other sources of employment. But I'd argue that you actually promote productivity and the constants of million low-income workers. Ultimately, when people can put food on the table, that is the biggest impact of today's round. When Representative Arul champions the argument about inflation lowering the minimum wage and Representative Hussein doing the same, two responses to that. There's still a net benefit in the status quo. I'd argue that the change happens year by year, and this is going to outpace inflation. And this will be a long-term effect rather than a short-term like any other negation speaker improves upon. But moving forward, This bill will actually lead to a decrease in turnover rates. Employers with fast turnover rates disproportionately spend money on firing workers and looking for new ones instead of keeping constant workers, because that's what the minimum job workers are, while maintaining a profitable business model. CNBC explains that in 2019, with a nationwide movement to raise minimum wage to $15 an hour, turnover rates would decline as a result, which means that less people will get fired annually. And this means that ultimately, because you care about our people, it is because our oath to constituents when we are elected that you must vote in the affirmation and bring stability back to the people.
Senator McCogan, thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 15 seconds. I now call upon 2 minutes of questioning, but before I do so, please respect the grace period in the future because we need to be expeditious as possible. And all questioners, please rise. This does go to questioning precedents. We'll go to Senator Mawaha and Senator Dash.
Hi, Representative. So just a quick question. I'm on your side, but how do we know that the money from these welfare programs are going to go to these causes that you state?
Okay, so my evidence directly states that the fact that if we increase the minimum wage per se, because people would move up in the income tax bracket and they would be taxed slightly more, we can use more of that money towards more social programs.
Yeah, I agree that we can. That would be great. But how do we know that that'll actually happen?
Okay, so we can't ensure that for sure under this bill, but I think we can safely assume that as a Congress, we can wholeheartedly say that we can still provide the necessary social welfare programs after this legislation.
Yeah, but like we have no guarantee that the money is going to go into this place. Like I agree, in a completely perfect world, the money would go there, but we have no guarantee, right?
Okay, although there is no guarantee, I can still assure you the fact that if we still increase the income tax bracket, we can still have more social welfare programs.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Dash.
Hi, Senator. So in your speech, you mentioned that being in a higher income tax bracket is better, right?
Yes.
So you're saying that it's better, but these people who are earning what, maybe $1, $2 extra a year are getting taxed at a higher rate?
But that's better than earning the $7 minimum wage rather than the $15 minimum wage.
But aren't they
still be making more money in the net benefit?
But they're being taxed more. Can you prove that the net result will still be more than their original earnings?
Yeah, because even though they would be taxed more, they would still earn more after taxes.
Aren't they also being removed from social welfare programs because they moved up a tax bracket?
They might be, but the fact is that only happens to a small minority of constituents.
So we should ignore those constituents?
No, but I'm saying that overall there's a net benefit.
But again, you're still causing the suffering of potentially millions of people across the U.S.
I never said that I'm causing the suffering of millions of people. I said that we're benefiting the United States.
Thank you, Senator. The questioning block has elapsed. Seeing as all of the speakers have spoken on this legislation, are there any motions at this time? Senator Dilip Kumar, you've been recognized.
I move to previous question.
There's been a motion to previous question. All those in favor of this motion, please raise your placard. This is a clear supermajority. We will now move into voting procedure. All those in favor of passing this legislation, A, minimum wage, please raise your placard. I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 votes for this legislation. I'll update the vote tally on this chart. And all those against this legislation, please raise your placard. I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 votes against. As a result, this legislation does not pass. It fails. And now, are there any motions? Senator Dash.
Noticing a natural pause in the flow of debate, I move for a 5-minute recess.
There's been a motion for a 5-minute recess. All those in affirmation of this motion, please raise your placard. Assuming unanimous consent, we will begin recess at 12:17 and it'll end at 12:22. And please work out the splits for the next bill, as we want to be as expedient as possible given time constraints. Thank you.
Before everyone goes like off camera, can we get the breaks like out? 1, 2.
Wait, what did you say?
Just we're doing breaks. Who's out?
Wait, I have a sponsorship speech. Does anyone else have a sponsorship speech?
I have a sponsorship speech too.
I mean, like,
okay.
You have presidents, so.
I kind of like I've asked. I'm not sure. How about Nag? Okay. One person from Meg should probably flip half.
Well, we've got the split seemed even. It was 5-6, right?
You'd have one more half because we can't break the cycle then Meg.
Yeah, so we had 5 and Af had 6, so I think that we're good.
I thought it was 6 for Neg and 5 for Af.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That works too.
Wait, what is it? Did anyone else count? Because I can't see everyone at once, so I might have missed somebody.
No, I think you're right. It was 5 af, 6 neg.
Send it on the Discord and we
Yeah. Use the emojis or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
At 12:22, I automatically call the session back into order. Is everyone here? Yes, I think so. Yes, everyone's here. And with that, 12:22, Bill B, Africa automatically comes off the docket. Now, are there any sponsors for this legislation? Please raise your placard. Senator Makovic. Actually, sorry about that. My apologies. Yeah. Due to speaker recency, Senator Zhang, you have the floor.
So my speaker code is 152. My last name is spelled Z-H-E-N-G. And could the judges let me know when you're ready? Thanks. Okay. My name is Jeff. No, it's not. Judging by how nobody laughed at that joke is dead. Sadly, it'll just be like the people in Africa if we choose to fail this legislation. So senators, let's affirm. Firstly, pass this legislation because the United States has a sole duty as a world leader to set an example. According to the Washington Post in April of this year, the current situation in Africa is further complicated by a variety of underlying health issues, including HIV, tuberculosis, malnutrition, and the list continues, making COVID-19 more difficult to treat than ever. And even moderate levels of infection will overwhelm African health systems. Alonso Soto, a journalist from Princeton University, reports that African countries will need to devote more than $100 billion in additional health spending to fight COVID-19. But their decreasing oil and commodity prices, crashing tourism revenues, and lower trade and direct foreign investments have made African nations vulnerable to an economic crisis, where early action by the United States to provide aid will not only improve our global standing, but work towards the advancement of international peace and security, according to the Global Affairs correspondent Howard French. Senators, human lives are at stake. I'm not suggesting we don't focus on the cases in the United States. By all means, this virus targets all of humanity, and humanity's response will not simply be a test of our sense of collective self-interest, but also of our collective soul. Secondly, senators, Africa is dangerously falling behind. The Associated Press reaffirmed this claim, stating that as Africa braces for a surge in coronavirus cases, its countries are dangerously behind in the global race for scant medical equipment. 10 nations have no ventilators at all, outbid by richer countries and not receiving medical gear from their top aid donor, the United States. African officials scramble for solutions as COVID-19 cases climb past 25,000. Even in the best scenario, the United Nations says 74 million test kits and 30,000 ventilators will be needed by the continent's 1.3 billion people this year, where very few are in hand. With the cases in Africa growing over 100,000 and facing an increase of deaths by at least 5,000, the Council of Foreign Relations reports that despite leadership by African officials, it doesn't remove the fact that these countries are lacking supplies to help individuals in need, as the healthcare system is already overwhelmed and will be pushed far beyond the effects of Ebola and the 1918 flu pandemic. Senators, this legislation proposes a solution dedicated to the idea of solvency, assistance from not only the United States, but the United Nations, to be able to afford the necessary medical equipment to save more lives. For many of us in this chamber, I'm sure at some point in quarantine, you've mentioned that you're bored and have nothing much to do. The case for individuals in Africa is similar, but they aren't bored. They're hungry, starving, deprived, and as for thousands, dying slowly. This legislation, believed by the negation, may be imperfect, except it's the only light at the end of the tunnel for the people in Africa. We must affirm.
Thank you, Senator, for that perfectly timed speech of 3 minutes. That being said, I now call on 2 minutes of questioning. All questioners, please rise. So we'll go to questioning precedents. That'll be Senator Pastorella and Senator Bressett.
Hi, Representative. So let's talk about this resolution's recommendation that the UN gives $15 billion. Do they have that money to give?
They have that money, yes. Based
They
on
do. They're not currently in a deficit.
They may be in a deficit, but they do have the money based on their
Right
economic
now, the
situation.
UN is actually cutting programs to starving children in Yemen. So how do they have enough money for $15 billion in Africa?
The Council on Foreign Relations has made separate reports about how the United Nations can actually do that.
They have an excess of $15 billion to give?
According to the Council of Foreign Relations.
But how is it true if they're cutting programs? I don't understand why they would cut programs that are successful in feeding starving children if they have extra money.
Sorry?
Why would they cut programs if they have extra money to starving children?
They may have their own reasons, but at our point of view, based on the United States Congress, we know that they have enough money and they can actually help provide aid.
Okay, why don't we just give the UN this money instead if they're in that deficit currently?
We could give the UN the money, but we also have the money for $1 billion as in the further resolved.
Hey, Senator Bressett.
Okay, so what did our government do a few days ago with regards to the WHO, which is like the public health wing of the UN?
I believe they left.
Yeah, we terminated all of our funding to the WHO, which accounts for about 15% of the dues it receives. Do you think that it's kind of hypocritical for us to expect this same organization, which we've just terminated funding for, to then turn around and give $15 billion in aid at our own request?
It may be, but we still have that duty as a world leader.
Do you think that they're going to be receptive to any attempts after we've shown that our commitment to multilateralism is hollow? Do you think they're going to be receptive to us telling them where to direct aid when they're already strapped for cash because we just cut 15% of their funding?
It may depend, but they may also agree with our stance on this situation.
So if we're dealing in hypotheticals, is it even worth passing today's legislation if we don't know for sure that it's going to have a measurable impact?
Necessarily, we can't be certain of the hypotheticals if we can't be 100% sure, that is.
Okay, thank you.
Chair absorbs the rest of the time. Seeing as I was speaking the affirmation, now call upon a speech in the negation. Speakers, please rise. This again does go to question speaking order. This will go to Senator Marwaha.
I thank the chair. This is Representative Marwaha speaking for the second and final time today. I'll just wait 5 seconds while my judges can get ready. Awesome. The United States has long championed itself as a global leader and a helping hand to countries across the globe. Now, don't get me wrong, I think that's absolutely fantastic. But it's time we realize that the most popular policy is not always the best one. So let's fail today's legislation and not take a step in the wrong direction. So first, I would like to clear up a misconception caused by the affirmation. The United States will end up funding much more than just this $1 billion that today's legislation outlines. That's because the United States, in fact, provides the majority of the money given to the United Nations. That's best quantified by the Center for Foreign Relations in 2017, which tells us that the United States is the largest provider of financial contributions to the United Nations, providing 22% of the entire United Nations budget in 2017. That amounts to over $10 billion. That means, chances are, by passing today's legislation, the burden of funding this project in Africa will fall once again back onto the United States, causing us to pay billions of dollars to this legislation. Now, next, let's see why the United States is actually in no position to donate this medical aid to Africa. That's because the United States, like Senator Zhang conceded, needs this money to fund our own hospitals and buy our own new equipment. That's quantified by the Department of Health and Human Services in March of 2020, which tells us that the United States needs 3.5 billion N95 masks to fully cover the COVID-19 pandemic. But right now, we only have 35 million in reserves. That's less than 1% of what we need. It's time we fix these problems in the United States. Next, Market Watch in 2020 tells us the CDC's prevention and public health budget has been flat and significantly underfunded for years. Only 2.5% of the healthcare budget goes to public health. Passing today's legislation means we would provide billions of dollars to Africa. And let me restate myself, I think that's fantastic. But let's fix our own domestic problems before moving on to Africa. It's time we fix this problem. 2.5% is never enough for the hundreds of our constituents suffering from this pandemic. So Representative Zhang, when you tell us about all of these horrible stories in Africa, they're undoubtedly true. But realize that these same stories are echoed in America. Let's not forget about our own constituents. We're American senators. Let's focus on our people and then move on to the rest of the world. Fail today's legislation. Don't make the wrong choice. Stay on the right side of history. Negate.
Senator, thank you for that speech of 2 minutes and 51 seconds. I now call upon 2 minutes of questioning. All questions, please rise. This does go to questioning precedents. That will go to Senator Dilip Kumar and Senator Wu.
Hi, Senator. So you talked about domestic versus international aid. Why are the two exclusive? We can spend money on our own hospitals and still give money to Africa.
Right. So I get where you're coming from, but let's fix our problems in the United States first, because those are far more urgent. I'm sure the rest of the negation is going to come up here and already quantify that Africa hasn't been hit as hard.
Yeah, even then, Africa has a much larger looming pandemic than the United States has in the future. Isn't the urgency in that reality why we need to pass?
Right. So if the affirmation can prove to me that Africa's cases are larger than the United States, and Africa right now is getting affected by the COVID-19 worse than the United States, then I'll agree with you.
But this funding isn't about what's happening right now. It's to prevent future cases, right? If we have this funding, we prevent future cases in Africa.
But let's realize that passing today's legislation would also completely ignore America. Today's legislation has absolutely no provisions for
I don't
American.
see why we can't also help America.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Wu.
Hi, Senator. Let's talk a little bit more about Mr. Dilip Kumar's question. So if it's true that both of our systems are broken, what can you tell me about the state of the coronavirus in Africa right now?
So it's definitely not as bad as the United States.
Okay. So, but more specifically, what can you tell me about their pre-pandemic preparedness for things like coronavirus outbreaks?
Yeah. So I'll concede to you that Africa's systems are not as sophisticated in the United States. I'm not coming up here to tell you that Africa doesn't need aid.
Right.
I'm here to tell you that the United States should prioritize itself first because we have the most cases in the world. That's something that we need to fix.
So if it's true that those systems cannot handle an onslaught of new cases, isn't it a matter of our security and our constituents' health to protect Africa from getting a second wave right now?
So
you
two
literally
things.
said it's preventative.
So one, I don't understand why our own constituents' health is at risk if Africa's hurt. And second, realize that the United States has the most cases. If you can prove to me that African cases will be increased, then I'll agree with you. But there's no evidence showing that Africa has been hit that hard.
Thank you, senators. And just before we move on to the next speech, we just want to make a quick comment from tabulation and our staff right now. We've just heard a couple minutes ago, I would say that there has been some reported social media activity going on and around. Just please respect the chamber and its process. We can't control what you do, obviously, but just make sure you respect the process. Thank you. And also, with that being said, I now call upon speakers in the affirmation. All speakers, please rise. Senator Makovic, you stand. Oh, never mind. Sorry. Senator Dosh, you didn't recognize.
I thank the chair. Yeah, my speaker code is 111. Yeah. Judges, ready? Good, cool. Okay. Africa has often been a blind spot in American foreign policy. When the Sudanese turn on each other in Darfur, we turned our backs. When the Hutus slaughtered the Tutsis, we turned our backs. When Liberia, when Chad, Mali, Niger, all of them dissolved into civil war, we pretty much turned our backs. Now is a time we learn from our mistakes from the past and move into the future. We have to affirm, not only because of the millions of refugees in Africa right now, but because Africa is a national security issue. But first, let's look at the refugees in Africa. Right now, according to UN in March of 2017, Africa has 80% of all refugees in the entire world. And as they elaborate on October 9th of 2018, there's about 68.5 million of them, and it will cost about 8.2 billion to support them. Now, this bill provides basically enough for that. Now you may be wondering, why do we care about refugees now? Well, refugee camps are often crowded, cramped, dirty, perfect places for the virus to spread. And these places don't have adequate medical facilities like anywhere else in the world. We need to help these people. Otherwise, we'll see the same problems that we saw in the Middle East. When they had refugee camps that we ignored, we started seeing terrorist groups emerge among the refugee population. Africa has had a long-standing security issue among refugees, among the poor, among the dispossessed, and a pandemic where the world ignores them will only make that worse. But second, let's look at the national security issue in Africa. China. According to Forbes, on October 2nd of 2019, China has $200 billion of trade with Africa, $2 trillion in business, and $300 billion in infrastructure. This is a massive investment, so massive indeed, that is forcing African countries into debt traps. According to Dow Jones on April 17th of 2020, loans from Chinese entities contain provisions that would force African countries to surrender state resources. We find that Africa is slowly becoming under the iron grip of China. China is encompassing the world, taking away one of the most developing regions in the world and making it their servant state. And to the negation who say we do not have enough money to counter this, I'd ask you to turn to the Federal Reserve of St. Louis, who says right now the U.S. government has about $1.85 trillion in reserves. We have enough money to counter. We are the richest nation in the world. We can stop this issue because this pandemic won't last forever. And when this pandemic ends, the nations of Africa, the nations of the world will be asking why the United States, the global policeman, the protector of law and order from places all across the world, did not step up and did not help the most needed. In the end, we have to look to our interests and the interests of those all across the world if we are to make our decisions. And the decision is to affirm.
Thank you, Senator, for that speech of 2 minutes and 59 seconds. I now call upon 2 minutes of questioning. All questioners, please rise. This goes to questioning precedence, so that'll be Senator Zhang, followed by Senator Krasinski.
Senator, so you mentioned different civil wars and genocides in Africa. How does this compare to the current pandemic?
Sure. So, as you know, right now, there are several wars going on in Africa, in the DRC, in Mali, in Nigeria, right? So right now, with a pandemic going on, the possibility for COVID-19 to spread alarmingly fast goes higher and higher. You can't really social distance in a conflict zone. So we have to at least contribute some measure of funds to help these countries shoulder this burden. As you said in your speech, we are at a loss for they are at a loss for ventilators and masks. And while we may not have quite as much as we would like, we do have enough to donate at least some fraction to them.
Right. And moving on to China, how do you believe with this legislation it would affect our relations, considerably what you said about China and its rule on Africa in a way?
Unfortunately, our relationship with China is never going to be in a perfect state. China is a brutal hegemonic regime that has exerted its control over Africa. We need to regain it, or otherwise these countries and us will suffer in the future.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Krasinski.
Let's actually talk about our relations with China in the state of the recent events, right? So during the pandemic, haven't we seen an increase in collaboration with multiple nations as it's a worldwide issue to fight this pandemic?
I mean, yes and no. When you talk about other nations, when you refer to, Europe and other nations that we are economically associated with, yes, there has been some degree of cooperation. But if we look at China, one of the biggest reasons we withdrew from the World Health Organization was because they were taking their orders from Beijing, not the world. So
okay, but they've also shipped out mass amounts of PPE and other financial aid to other nations, as well as the US, right?
Yes and no. You can see that these PPE and this financial aid always came with exceptions. And
but it has been. We've seen an increase in this being shipped all around the world. Yes or no?
I mean, they are the biggest producers.
So don't we risk this relationship bettering if we pass?
Well, economic relationships rarely suffer. Like if we buy PPE, they're not going to stop selling.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator. Seeing as I have speech in the affirmation, now call upon a speech in the negation. All speakers, please rise. This does go to questioning precedence and recency. Senator Krasinski, you've been recognized.
I thank the chair. Once again, it's Senator Korsunski, speaking code 163. Assuming everybody is ready, I will begin. PL, we're good? Perfect. Pride and prejudice, both concepts America is all too familiar with. But it's only when we can overcome our prejudices and stop putting pride before progress. Then I will truly be able to say that I am proud to be an American. Today we negate because first, China is better equipped to support Africa during the pandemic than the US and the UN. Mr. Dash on the affirmation tells us we need to intervene to assert our dominance over China. But understand that if our goal today is actually to help Africa mitigate the impacts of the coronavirus, the most effective way to do this is to allow China to take over. Foreign Policy explains in April of 2020 that as the world's largest producer of solar panels and batteries, and the fastest growing manufacturer of medical device equipment, China has all of the necessary ingredients: renewable energy, healthcare technology, investment ready, and abundant capital and deep diplomatic and business ties to help Africa during the pandemic. Rather than wasting billions of dollars, we can allow China to provide Africa with the support necessary to effectively combat the pandemic. But then this is where I separate myself from Mr. Marwaha's American-centric views, and instead urge that we use our money to support other countries that would not have received aid from another world power. Mr. Zhang and Mr. Dash, I am not on the negation because I don't believe Africa needs aid. I'm on the negation because that's what gets it to them. The affirmation's selfish motives tells you that they're not actually trying to help Africa. Otherwise, their vote would be cast in the negation. So when our foreign policy is characterized by ego rather than ethos, the affirmation seems all too willing to pass any policy in order to assert political arrogance. But next, we negate because the United Nations intervention will discourage the newfound global cooperation that will likely last beyond the pandemic. As we all know, relations between Russia, China, and the US have become increasingly tense over the past decade. However, that's recently taken a turn for the better. Center for Foreign Relations explains on April 24th of 2020 that the pandemic has encouraged cooperation among countries. China has offered masks and testing kits to international organizations and hard-hit countries across Europe and Africa. Russia has sent PPE to the US in addition to sending aid to Italy and Serbia. Let's understand that passing today risks this new wave of cooperation. As foreign policy explains in April of 2020, there is a deadlock on how to deal with the crisis, and it comes from the UNSC and the UN. They have failed to agree on a way to move forward with the aid. Mr. Zhang, I am also aiming for international peace, but in the world of the affirmation, we risk disrupting the newfound balance between the US in opposition to the rest of the UNSC when it comes to proceeding with coronavirus aid. Mr. Zhang told Mr. Brissett that the UN may agree with our methods of dealing with the virus, but clearly that's not the case. Mr. Dash told me on cross that economic relationships won't suffer, but understand they will. If we make a move and assert our dominance over the UN, we're simply angering Russia and China. If we pass legislation against them and assert our power, the cooperation suddenly disappears, and we risk triggering the two major world powers, especially ones that are continuing to develop strong nuclear weapons, endangering every single American life. If we pass today, we unleash chaos worldwide. When our intervention brings an imbalance of foreign power, we must be willing to give up our pride for our principles.
Thank you, Senator, for that speech of 3 minutes and 5 seconds. I now call upon 2 minutes of questioning. All questioners, please rise. This goes to questioning precedents. That'll be Senator Marwaha and Senator Dash.
So, hi, Representative. So, you caught my view of today's legislation America-centric, but how is valuing 1.8 million cases over 100,000 America-centric?
So I'm not saying that we put our aid into Africa. In fact, it's exactly the opposite of what I'm saying. But I'm saying that we do have aid that if we don't pass, we can allocate to other struggling nations. It doesn't have to be Africa. It can be the ones that are incredibly hard hit in Europe.
Right. But how is valuing American lives, which are so many more cases in America, bad? Why is that?
It's not at all bad, but we don't have to do one or the other. We can do both.
But how can we do both under today's legislation?
I don't want today's legislation. I'm on the negation. I'm on your side, Mr. Marwaha.
Sorry, I think I got caught up in questioning. What I meant is that how is valuing the American lives, like I said in my speech, a bad thing?
It's not at all a bad thing. It's not at all a bad thing. But we can value American lives and provide aid elsewhere that needs it too.
Thank you.
Senator Dash.
Hi, Senator. Does China have Africa's best interests at heart?
Okay, so in your speech, you proved that China tries to manipulate Africa, okay? But the bottom line is they need aid and China has the resources that will most effectively help Africa, both with this pandemic and epidemics that they suffered in the past.
So are you suggesting that we do not make PPE and we do not make ventilators and we don't have money?
No, I'm suggesting that China has the most efficient method to help Africa the quickest and in the most effective manner.
Do you have any evidence to show that Chinese help would be any better than American help of the same?
Yes, according to Foreign Policy in April 2020. It was in my speech.
So you're saying that the same amount of aid that we can give Africa would be better if it came from China?
I'm saying that China is most equipped to help Africa deal with the coronavirus in the most effective and efficient manner.
So why would it hurt for us to donate even more?
Like, it wouldn't, but it's not necessary if we can put our money in places that China won't, and other struggling European nations and all around the world.
Thank you, Senators. The questioning block has elapsed. That being said, I now call upon a speech and an affirmation. All speakers, please rise. This goes to speaking precedence and recency. Let's see. Senator Arul, you've been recognized.
Thank you. This is Senator Arul speaking for the second and final time. Session. My speaking code is 105. And as always, if anyone isn't ready, just let me know. All right, cool. When considering our foreign policy, our Congress has always affirmed our interest in safety. We must always consider safety as the most important goal to ensure stability in our entangled global network. Yet when we do not give critical aid to Africa, we risk leaving Africa and the rest of the world in deep political turmoil. Now, first, we must understand what happens when we do not stop the spread of coronavirus in Africa, which would lead to a refugee crisis entangling the entire world. According to Shai Dromi of Harvard University's Department of Sociology on March 30th, 2020, Africa's precarious medical care infrastructure and limited state capacities leave few resources available for addressing a medical emergency. The abundance of refugees and internally displaced persons in the Chad Basin area make the entire region fertile ground for epidemics. A large-scale migration of potential carriers of an infectious disease is nothing short of disastrous. We need aid to avoid billions of dollars in losses. African efforts to stop the spread of coronavirus and ease the harms start with ensuring border security, and that starts with the necessary aid entailed in this legislation. But Senator Marwara, you asked us to look at the economic impacts of this outbreak. But when we do that, it's clear a potential refugee crisis with billions of dollars in losses, not just to African nations, but to the entire world, wouldn't be ideal for our economy and would not be ideal for our global economy. Similarly, when Senator Korsunski discusses global instability with Chinese intervention, I argue to the harms of the negation will directly lead to even more political instability in a refugee crisis. If we allow for more instability, we're simply ignoring a growingly precarious situation. But second, aid gives the United States the ability to implement a democratic process in sub-Saharan Africa for our benefit. Now, according to Chidi Orekandu of the Open Society Foundation on April 27, 2020, over 20 African nations this year will have elections. This year of elections are critical in continuing a democratic process without leaving instability. However, without mitigating the effects of COVID-19, elections may not be feasible. These elections are on the line, and political stability in Africa is on the line. So Representative Korsunski, when you bring up political turmoil, the number one concern is our constituents' safety and our world's safety, and that would not be sustained if we have political turmoil and a political gap in Africa. It's clearly in our interest to protect our nation's safety as we affirm as a Congress, but we cannot make the same mistakes we've made in the past and leave these nations back to where they were, something with devastating consequences around the world.
Thank you, Senator, for that speech of 3 minutes and 7 seconds. I now call upon 2 minutes of questioning. All questioners, please rise. Let's see, that'll go to Senator Zhang, followed by Senator Pascarella.
Hi, Senator. So from your view of the affirmation, what do you believe is the most efficient step in order to make sure that this legislation, if passed, is successful?
So what we're doing, there are things like direct cash transfers, there are things like making sure the infrastructure is stable and just making sure the pandemic doesn't change with like things like PPE and medical supplies. All those things count as donations, all those things help prevent.
Okay. And I also want to get your point of view. How do you believe that the United States may be better equipped compared to maybe another country like China?
So what we need to do as a Congress is affirm democratic processes. And what we've tried to do in like the past 2 decades is try to ensure that these nations have democratic ideals and elections. But that's simply pretty much going to be wiped out the gate if we don't have this pandemic sustained in the next 6 months.
And you do mention democratic elections again. Exactly how would that benefit the United States?
So what we've seen in like the past 50 years is when there's a dictator in Africa, that almost always is not going to help us. We need a stable political situation for our global economy.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Pascarella.
Hi, Senator. I want to talk about what actually happens when we send aid over to Africa. Do U.S. organizations that implement aid have a good perception in the continent?
In certain nations, yes.
Then why did we build Liberian treatment centers for Ebola that were never used?
I'm unaware of that. I would think that there was a miscommunication or some lack of planning.
Right. So also there's an issue with the fact that citizens in other, like not just Liberia, but other African countries just don't trust our government. So how do we solve that by just giving them more money?
Well, giving aid in any capacity is what we need to make sure that political instability doesn't ensue. And that the problem you're mentioning is political instability. So if we keep exacerbating the issue by holding off aid, allowing undemocratic processes, we're not gonna.
But if those that are sick with coronavirus don't trust AFRICOM and USAID enough to accept medical treatment, then how does this help anyone? How does this change anything?
I'm sure there are many nations that do accept medical treatment from America, and that's enough to make a lasting difference with the refugee crisis that could ensue and with the other crises that could ensue.
Thank you, senators. So you guys have a speech in the affirmation, and now call upon speeches in the negation. All speakers, please rise. Going off of speaking precedence and recency. This goes to Senator Bressett.
I thank the chair. Again, that's Senator Ben Bressett, Speaker Code 128, speaking in the negation of today's legislation for the second and final time this legislative session. I assume my judges are ready, so I'll just go ahead and get my timer ready, and then I'll start. The English writer Samuel Johnson once wrote that hell is paved with good intentions. While it may seem hyperbolic and contradictory at first, understand that within the context of today's debate, it could not be clearer that good intentions with a bad approach are more dangerous than no approach at all. But first, fail today because the resolved clause of this legislation seeks to compel a United Nations that's currently in financial disarray due to this pandemic to provide aid that it simply can't afford to deliver. Now, Senator Pasquarella asked Senator Zhang if the UN currently has the money to allocate this aid, and she referenced the deficit that it's in. And this is a really important point because according to Politico in April of this year, the UN as an institution is itself facing a financial crisis during this pandemic, with many member states being unable to fund their dues. As a result, the UN barely has enough money to continue peacekeeping operations through June and is expecting a collection gap of more than $220 million. The hypocrisy of our government in demanding organizations like the World Health Organization, which is the public health wing of the UN, to provide aid is especially glaring as foreign policy tells us 2 days ago that the US has just announced that we'll be terminating all of our funding to the WHO, which has in the past relied on American support for roughly 15% of its total budget. Now, I asked Senator Zhang about how we can expect the WHO to cough up $15 billion in aid after we've withdrawn all funding, and he conceded that it's all hypothetical. So then the question comes down to where a WHO that's had its funding withdrawn by our government and a UN at large that is hundreds of millions of dollars behind its regular due collection projections gets the money for $15 billion in additional aid. And the answer is simply that they don't. That's why we fail, because we need to readjust our expectations to more realistic realities. But second, we fail today because of the inherent geographic composition of African nations, which makes the delivery of aid to those who actually need it incredibly logistically difficult. Now, Senator Zhang mentions the vast shortages of medical supplies in Africa, which is by and large a failure of government. But he doesn't similarly extend this logic to their official records that dictate where aid would go. And the New Humanitarian expands on this in an article published this month, which states that across the continent, 85% of people don't have access to formal employment, 66% don't have bank accounts, and 41% have no national IDs, making it especially difficult for their governments to track down the poorest and neediest citizens in desperate need of support. Senator Dash, you talk about blind spots in foreign policy, but you fail to understand that the African governments we would seek to fund by passing today's legislation would be forced to allocate resources and develop policy with very few official statistics and resources that help them determine where exactly those funds need to go. The Economist expands on this in a report published this month, which tells us that even simple information about life and death is often unavailable, with 1 in 8 births in Tanzania being recorded and only 3% of deaths in Niger being recorded. Policy without data is meaningless. Even if we pass today's legislation and assume compliance from international bodies, the chances of this aid being able to target those who need it most are slim at best. I admire the good intentions of the affirmation, but I know all too well that good intentions backing ill-informed policy is a surefire recipe for disaster. Negate.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 16 seconds. Please don't abuse the grace period for everyone in the future. And now I call upon 2 minutes of questioning. All questioners, please rise. This will go to Senator Arul and Senator Krasinski.
Hi, Senator. So you mentioned giving aid to every person or directly giving aid might be difficult. But even if we were to give aid to some significant portion of citizens of those African nations, isn't that helping reduce the political instability?
Okay, well, here's the problem. The majority of people in African countries who have things like formal employment, national IDs, those are people who are in the upper middle classes of their economies. So poorer people who are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 won't be able to get the assistance that they need because they're typically the ones who don't have these government IDs that help us determine where aid needs to go.
Economy of that continent is sustained by stability and having that stability. So ensuring that at least some aid is given, some aid is used for preventing the spread of COVID-19, isn't that helping solve the crises that could happen in the future?
But if we're not able to target the people who need this aid the most, then it's not going to be effective in the long run. We're not going to be getting the most effective outcome that we could. That's simply why we can't pass today's legislation.
Have intervention methods to actually give that aid to necessary places that will actually give it to the people themselves.
This legislation doesn't specify any intervention methods, though I'm taking it at face value, and at face value, we fail.
Thank you, Senators. Senator Krasinski.
Hi, Senator. So in this legislation specifically, it doesn't say that we have to allocate this aid to the government, right?
Not necessarily, no.
Okay, so say that we intervene and we instead give our aid to like nonprofits or the Red Cross or other organizations that are fighting the spread of COVID-19 in Africa already.
Right, so I would contend that a lot of those NGOs that you reference also determine where their aid needs to go based on those official government statistics and figures, which are really, really, really inadequate right now. I understand that NGOs are doing good work on the ground in the status quo, but we need to understand that this aid still may not be able to get to those who need it most, and that's why we fail, because there are other governments that are more well-equipped to do that, which you outlined in your speech.
Sure, but they've been in place since like the Ebola outbreak, right? So we can assume that Doctors Without Borders or other NGOs have had a long access to people who are in need of medical help in Africa, right?
Yeah, potentially. I acknowledge that.
So why wouldn't they be able to also track the ones that are in desperate need of help?
Because this legislation doesn't say specifically that it's only going to NGOs.
Thank you, Senator. Seeing as that was a speech in the negation, now call upon a speech in the affirmation. All speakers, please rise. Senator Dilip Kumar, you've been recognized.
Awesome, thank you. I'm happy to get started. I know the judges said they're ready. I'll just wait a couple seconds. Be ready to go.
And just a quick comment before we start. Since we don't have much time for recesses, just a quick comment. Just please check the Zoom chat for how many openings we have in each side now. Thank you.
All right, I'll get started. The story of the African people has become one of oppression, warfare, and starvation. The story of the American people has become one of ignorance and neglect. I call on this Congress to rewrite this story of tomorrow. Pass today's legislation. Now, the first reason why you pass is because this aid reduces misinformation about the coronavirus pandemic in Africa. Al Jazeera explains on May 7, 2020, that misinformation containment in Africa. That's because people are turning to home remedies instead of actual healthcare. Now, you might say today's legislation has no solvency. Senator Pascarella, in questioning, says that African countries don't trust the US. And Senator Brissett said that aid delivery is difficult, but the reality is both of these claims are categorically false. We've done similar aid in the past with pretty effective results. The Public Library of Science explained on July 18, 2016, along with US aid on July 2, 2019, that in the Ebola epidemic, issues with misinformation was caused because of a lack of dialogue with community leaders within more rural African neighborhoods. Instead, what US aid and the UN did to directly counteract that is ensure that this aid delivery is specifically targeted towards this issue. That creates proactive legislation that prevents future cases. That way, we don't even have to deal with there are no cases to begin with. Proper containment ensures that. That's exactly what this legislation ensures. The impact of this is that we stop the spread at the source. We don't have to deal with hundreds of thousands of Africans losing their life because this Congress didn't take action. Today's legislation is finally the solvency that we need. But let's address second a fundamental question of today's debate. Why is the United States the best equipped to help Africa? Senator Marwaha and Senator Kursunski, both on the negation, say that the US simply isn't equipped to help Africa. And Senator Marwaha extends that US cases are far greater than those in Africa, so we shouldn't help. Let's understand, that's not why we help. That's not why we have foreign aid. We have foreign aid right now to ensure that future cases don't result, and that's exactly why we need to pass. He asks the affirmation to prove that Africa will have more cases in the near future than the United States. Let me do exactly that. The Global Health Journal explains on April 28th, 2020, that Africa has the greatest looming pandemic except for India, specifically because of the poor infrastructure that virtually every single affirmation speaker before me has mentioned. More so, foreign cases come from Africa to the United States if we don't have proper containment strategies. The impact is twofold. We help Africa and we help the United States by reducing cases in the future on the African continent. Understand, the story of today has already been written. I'm calling on this Congress. Rewrite the story of tomorrow to one of kindness, compassion, and truth. Pass today's legislation.
Thank you, Representative, for the second senator, for that speech of 3 minutes and 2 seconds. I now call upon 2 minutes of questioning. All questioners, please rise. Let's see. That'll go to Senator Makovic, followed by Senator Bressett.
All right, so Representative, can you please tell me how this bill would directly affect our citizens?
Our citizens? So, well, first of all, we have more influence in Africa when we give Africa aid. But more so than that, when we limit the number of cases,
how do you back that claim?
We have, one sec, let me finish. When we have less,
Dash has stated that China already has an immense foot within Africa with their trapped diplomacy.
Yeah, sure. Let me explain the second impact then. Let me explain the second impact.
Okay.
If we have less cases in Africa, we have less people coming from Africa to the United States, importing more cases. So that's a twofold impact, reducing cases in the United States as well.
But we don't have any statistics as to how many tourists from Africa go to the US.
Yeah, sure, but we obviously see the exact same thing happening from Europe and China in the past. Africa isn't that with regard to travel from the United States to that country. Even if we stop cases by like 70%, that would still make a massive difference in the United States.
But Senator Bressett.
Oh, okay. So you referenced the Ebola epidemic as proof that we have the logistical capacity, that we have the targeting capacity to be able to see who needs aid the most. But how effective exactly was the United States response to Ebola?
Okay, cool. I think I see where you're going. And my point isn't that the Ebola epidemic response was like completely effective, right? I'm saying that we already have the logistical framework in place for this aid delivery to be even better.
But if our logistical framework didn't result in an effective outcome, then can we even say that that framework itself is effective at delivering aid to those who need it most?
So the issue of misinformation in the coronavirus pandemic is even larger than it was with regard to Ebola. If we specifically target that issue, it's going to be more effective this time.
Why? Why will it be more effective this time?
Because we're targeting exactly what the problem is. If we stop the problem at the source, before we see a massive influx of cases like we did in Ebola, we create better legislation because it's proactive prior to a massive influx of cases.
Okay, thank you.
Chair absorbs the rest of the time. And seeing as I was speech in the affirmation, I'll call upon a speech in the negation. All speakers, please rise. Senator Hussein, you have the floor.
I thank the chair. I'll just begin. I think my judges are ready. All right. Cool. It saddens me that every time the United Nations tries to create solutions in Africa, their first step is to always throw money at the problem. It's happened for decades, and all we've seen in those decades is instability rising, terror becoming skyrocket, and the people who are suffering. It's time we change that narrative and fail today's legislation. So first, let's realize how this legislation fails on two fronts: the implementation and the execution of this bill. So when it comes to the implementation, it's about time we realize that no matter how hard we urge the United Nations, they simply don't have the funds to allocate for this legislation. Now, the affirmation predicates their entire argument on the notions that these African people need aid, and they need it now, which is absolutely true. But understand that the $15 billion will not reach there in time because the United Nations simply doesn't have the funds for it in the status quo. And that's because the appeal the United Nations has received is not nearly the amount of money we are asking them to provide. Now, this is something Senator Pascarella asked Senator Zhang about in questioning. But allow me to quantify this number for you all. Now, the New York Times in March of 2020 highlights that the United Nations warned in a $2 billion appeal to combat this epidemic. Yes, $2 billion, simply 13% of the $15 billion that we are urging through this resolution. So, Senator Dilip Kumar, you say that the United Nations has had the budget to send billions of dollars to Africa in the past. But the key part is that was the past. It's time you realize that the United Nations coronavirus budget is heavily underfunded. However, that isn't the end of the problem. The New York Times article goes on to further that these funds will be provided to the United Nations over the next 9 months. We can't immediately be giving Africa aid. This means that the United Nations is virtually powerless to generate change. The coronavirus in Africa for 9 months would be completely destructive. And Senator Dash, I agree with you. Africa needs money, and $15 billion would help greatly. But it's simply not going to happen. Look past Senator Zhang's rhetoric. This legislation has no solvency, undermining all of the affirmative impacts. But furthermore, if you pass the legislation, you strengthen terror groups all throughout Africa. And that's because they will intercept any aid that goes in and use it to support their own cause. And to understand how this happens, you need to realize the purpose of our aid. It's entirely meant to benefit the African people who are in lockdown and have no access to either food, water, or medical supplies. They need this aid to survive. When terror organizations realize it, this aid automatically becomes their number one priority. And this is proven by security analyst Bulami Burkati from the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, where she finds that resources marked for the provision of healthcare and humanitarian supplies to communities in need may have to be diverted to prevent it from being intercepted. So imagine what will happen if we donate $15 billion. That automatically becomes the number one target for every terror organization within the region. And the Council of Foreign Relations in May of 2020 highlights how big of a problem this is. They find that these groups might increase service provisions, stepping in where the state is failing, and medical, water, and food provisions to build popular support for their cause. So, Senator Dash, you believe that refugee groups turn to terrorism through this legislation because these terror groups can provide for them. That only happens under your affirmative world. If you pass the legislation, the terror groups will be the only one able to provide, and the African people will look to Boko Haram and ISIS as their heroes, not the United States or the United Nations. Fail this legislation.
Thank you, Senator, for that speech of 3 minutes and 13 seconds. Once again, please do not abuse the grace period. And calling all questioners, please rise. This goes to questioning questions. Then I'll go to Senator Dilip Kumar, followed by Senator Zhang.
So you contend that the UN doesn't have enough money, right?
Yes.
And this is a resolution that we can enforce with future legislation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Why can't the US and other developed countries give more funding to the UN to be able to ensure that African aid is actually passed through?
Well, see, before it was ever $2 billion, the United Nations was asking for more money. And that's when the $2 billion was finally hit. That's when the United States offered almost $800 million. That's just the amount of money that we've been giving in the past, and I have no idea how we're going to reach $15 billion.
Okay, exactly. If the UN needs that much money, why can't the US and other developed countries ensure that that funding is provided?
Well, because they haven't been. Literally, the United Nations was asking for money, and that's when they finally hit the $2 billion. That's when the United States gave $800 million. There's no guarantee that we'd be able to supply the other $13 billion.
Yeah, but this is a resolution, right? We can enforce it with future legislation. Isn't that exactly what the point of this bill is?
We can't influence legislation on countries that simply don't have the funds to do so.
Senator, so do you know exactly where the UN funding exactly comes from?
Well, it comes from the entire world.
Right, but I'm sorry. Right. So exactly why couldn't they actually urge more funding in order to help other countries instead of just the United States?
So like I was telling Representative Dilip Kumar, the problem before was that the United Nations didn't have enough money. That's when they asked for even more money, and that's when they finally hit $2 billion. It's not like $2 billion is a small amount for the rest of the world right now. Everyone, no countries are giving that much money.
When did they hit $2 billion?
It happened in April.
So do you believe there's a possible chance we can pass this legislation later down the line or enact it and to provide enough time for the UN to reach that 15 billion?
Yes, sure. But like I said, that 2 billion isn't guaranteed right now. It's going to be generated over the next 9 months, meaning that, and I don't know what's going to be happening to Africa within the next 9 months, but the other 13 billion would take even years to come up with.
Do you know exactly how many months possibly?
Well, 9 months for the 2 billion and at least a couple of years for the 13.
Thank you, senators. Seeing as that was speech in the negation, and I'll call upon a speech in the affirmation. All speakers, please rise. Senator Pascarella, you have the floor.
Hi, that's Senator Pascarella speaking for the second and last time this legislative session. My code once again is 180. Just give me any indication if you're not ready. I'm just gonna get my phone out to time too.
And also, just as a future note to, depending on how much time we have left, we may have to cut the questioning blocks in the future to 30 seconds. So we'll see how it goes. Thank you.
Susie Chasm, an American poet and philosopher, once said, "As a citizen of the world, I stand only with truth and conscience as my leader." In today's debate, the affirmation is the only side that stands as a good citizen of the world by prioritizing truth and conscience, even in a time where it's so much easier for each and every one of us to focus solely on ourselves and on our own country. Understand that we need to go through the arguments that were made in today's round to understand how we pass this legislation, because we succeed in the two aspects that make us a better citizen of our world. That's truth and conscience. But first, we need to understand the truth about the efficacy that USAID has had in the past with dealing with health crises in Africa. Senator Karunsi tells us that Africa is already receiving aid from China, but what you don't talk about is the quality that that aid has, because a lot of that aid is coming from the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, and that aid comes with strings attached. They are predatory loans that are only hurting Africa. But let's move on to that point, because a lot of the negation speakers have only talked about the hypothetical failure that this aid will have. They have not grounded it in any facts or talked about what's actually happened in the past. Look to McComb School of Business from the University of Texas in July of 2019, which reported that the Operation United Assistance, which was the US's initiative during the 2014 Liberia Ebola outbreak, was that after the US built 11 treatment centers, the number of cases of Ebola dropped from 635 to 100 in just a few months. We have seen a lot of success in the past when it comes with USAID dealing with a health crisis in Africa. Senator Dilip Kumar also starts to talk about what happened in the past with Ebola. He talks about how misinformation in that time was improved by USAID. And he's absolutely correct, because the misinformation that we see during the time of COVID-19 now is the same exact reason that I talked about the lack of trust in questioning with Senator Arul earlier. Because when citizens in Africa and different countries around the world do not believe that there's a problem in the first place, then they're less likely to accept help from the government. What we saw in the Ebola crisis was that people did not believe that the disease was real. They thought it was man-made and made by the government. But because USAID came in and improved that and gave them more information, they became a lot more willing to accept the treatment that we had to give them. But next, let's talk about the idea of conscience, because we can finally rebuild our reputation as a global power working with the UN and rebuild our conscience. Senator Bressett and Hussein both tell us that we withdrew funding from the WHO, and they're absolutely right. And I'm not going to try to justify why that happened. I frankly don't understand why President Trump made that decision. But this actually helps us to bring the UN back from the current deficit that is seen in its aid programs. According to the UN website itself, the WHO Foundation, which is where our money was actually going before we cut it, is legally separate from the UN in terms of funding. What this means is that when we cut that funding to the WHO, we can now take it and give it to the UN to fix that $30 billion deficit that they're seeing with aid. And so when Senator Hussein tells us that we fail to prove that the UN aid is going to have any kind of defense and it's only going to fall in the hands of terrorists, understand that that's categorically false. Because when we give the UN more aid, they can finally have the funding that they need to defend it from anyone that is going to try to steal it. Understand that we have two impacts in today's legislation. We help with USAID, we help with UN aid, and we finally become a better citizen of our world through truth and through conscience. Affirm.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 12 seconds. I now call upon 2 minutes of questioning. All questions, please rise. This goes to Senator Wu and Hussein.
Hi, Representative. So let's talk about leadership. So if we've been disengaged with African affairs like Senator Dash has proven in his speech, why can we just reverse course now, come back into Africa, and expect them to just bend to us willingly?
Right, so we haven't been completely disengaged. We started the Liberia initiative called Operation United Assistance in 2014. We were in Africa and in Liberia for a period of a few years. So it's really only been like maybe 4 years tops that we haven't been in Africa. That's not that long.
Sure. So right now, do African governments have a better perception of, say, China and Beijing or Washington than the US?
Look, perception doesn't really matter. The truth is that China, during its Belt and Road Initiative, is giving them aid with strings attached that's only going to hurt their economies.
Right, but if we enter African affairs now and start competing with Beijing on foreign policy over there, why are African nations more willing to accept our aid rather than their aid, which has been in the long term?
China also had some role in like giving aid during the Ebola crisis, and they still accepted our aid that was coming from the US, because at the end of the day, medical treatment is medical treatment regardless of where you're getting it.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Hussein.
Hey, Senator Pascarella. So you told me that in your speech that because we're giving more aid, they will be able to back up the aid and make sure it doesn't get into the hands of terrorists. Why hasn't that happened in the decades before?
So the problem here is that what you were talking about is the fact that the UN has a deficit of $30 billion. So when you have a deficit of that much money, you cannot possibly give the aid to defense, to medical treatment, to everything that you need. But under this legislation today, we can give them that money that they need because we've cut the funding that we gave to the WHO in the past.
So if I prove to you that their current coronavirus budget is $2 billion, what guarantees you that they will protect this aid from going into the hands of terrorists?
Because why wouldn't they when they have $2 billion to spend? And
happened in 50 years when they had even more money.
Look, we can talk about the ways that the UN has had success in the past. In Yemen, they're helping starving children. That aid is extremely successful. Because the US hasn't given them more money, that program has been cut completely.
But specifically in Africa, even when we had more money, we were never able to do this.
Thank you, Representative. Seeing as that was a speech in the affirmation, and I'll call for a speech in the negation. All speakers, please rise. Senator Wu. And starting from this speech, since we don't have much time left, we will automatically shorten questioning blocks by half. So there'll be 2 30-second blocks. Thank you.
Okay, assuming all microphones are ready, this is still Senator Wu speaking for the second time. My last name is W. My speaker code is 101. I'll begin. It seems as though, as today's debate concludes, we have entirely abstracted away from the fundamental question of today's resolution, and that's how do we best assist Africa in keeping the coronavirus under control? Let's return to that debate and settle once and for all why today's legislation can never accomplish any of the affirmative goals. Every affirmation speaker has missed the forest for the trees on what the intent of today's resolution is. The resolution provides funding to nations hit hard by the virus, but it never considers the impact of providing aid to nations with fewer cases right now. In these nations, our aid is much more valuable as it can be used to implement aggressive testing to detect cases early on and for social distancing measures if more cases are detected. Preventative measures like those will decrease the possibility of new outbreaks. If our goal is truly to contain coronavirus and keep it under control in Africa, there is no use in giving more money to countries that already been hit hard. It's more practical for us to give money to nations that have not faced the brunt of the impact yet. The status quo approach to global healthcare policy has just been spending money. According to the Kaiser Family Foundation on March 12th of this year, in fiscal year 2020, the US has already totaled $11.2 billion in global health funding. However, this strategy of just spending more money to promote better healthcare policy needs immediate change. It cannot remain the same like it would if we passed today's legislation. The Center for Strategic and International Studies explains on May 1st of this year that we need to change the US approach to global health aid on focusing strengthening weak healthcare systems in Africa instead of acting reactively to Ebola, and then to SARS, and then to coronavirus on a disease-to-disease basis. The US government should not double down on our existing strategy. It needs to focus on getting things running and functional on the ground, not just throwing money at the problem. We cannot contain the coronavirus by giving money. We have to set up infrastructure. We have to get people on the ground to help African nations. So Senator Marwaha is correct. The cases in Africa are much less. But the key part of the debate that he's missing is that the future. Al Jazeera explains on May 7th that the WHO has warned of a massive second wave in Africa that could infect upwards of 30 million Africans if not properly contained. Understand the brunt of the impact of the pandemic hasn't even hit Africa yet. If today's legislation aims to keep COVID-19 under control, passing would miss the point. But now let's briefly talk about China. Senators Pascarella and Dilip Kumar both mentioned how America is best equipped to help Africa. But according to Mark Green, the lead administrator for U.S. aid, he's outlined in 2018 that the differences in U.S. and Chinese aid are designed to offer a clear choice to African nations. One of the most important arguments here is between us and China. Passing this aid package is literally asking Africa to make a choice. U.S. aid officials admit that, and they're going to choose China. So Senator Zhang, your legislation helps Africa in the short term. I'll agree, but it will always hurt Africa in the long term. Remember that when you vote. Fail.
Senator, thank you for that speech of 2 minutes and 56 questions. I now call upon 1 minute of questioning. All questioners, please rise. I'll go to Senator Dosh, followed by Senator Arul.
Hi, Senator. So do you suggest we abandon the countries that are currently suffering from the pandemic?
I'm not saying we should abandon them, but the entire intent of the legislation is to keep coronavirus under control in Africa. This legislation doesn't do that.
So we should let it run rampant in countries it's already in.
We wouldn't let it run rampant, but throwing money at the problem is not going to fix it. I advocate for a solution that actually sets up efficient and effective infrastructure on the ground for these healthcare systems to contain the virus, not just throw money at the governments to fix it themselves.
Hi. So I understand concern about reactive action, but isn't our number one priority preventing these infected travelers from potentially seeking refuge in other places?
So I guess we can look at the big picture here, right? So I read you evidence that says that the WHO has predicted a massive onslaught of new coronavirus cases in the coming months, and if we don't brace for that with the nations that don't have strong public health infrastructure and are not affected now, we're not going to be able to contain the coronavirus.
That massive onslaught starts with affected nations. So by stopping
Thank you, Senator Arul. Thank you, senators. Seeing as our speech in negation, I can now call on our final speech in the affirmation. Please rise, senators. Senator Markovic, you've been recognized.
I thank the chair for recognizing the last speaker. My speaker code is 148. I repeat, 148. At the leisure of all those above me, please give me an indication when you are ready so I may begin. Great. As Martin Luther King Jr. once said, life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? The U.S. is in an extreme position to help the rest of the world in times of utter catastrophe. Therefore, senators, we must ask ourselves, what can we do to help? But the thing is that speakers on negation do not want to help the rest of the world, just like Martin Luther King Jr. But this is where we have to dive into the negation's problematic contentions. As we first start off with Senators Wu and Korsunsky, when they start mentioning China and relation to Africa. So when Korsunsky and Wu start talking about China and allow China to gain control and allegedly help Africa, this is complete nonsense. When we allow China to gain a greater foothold within the African continent, we are just making China even stronger. Just a week ago, just a couple of days ago, China already took over Hong Kong with the world panicking. And this is what will happen to Africa. China is now Africa's biggest trade partner, with 10,000 Chinese-owned firms currently operating throughout the African continent, with $2 trillion invested in the continent. China's debt trap diplomacy will allow Korsunsky and Senators Wu to ignore the fact that China will take over the continent. Stepping aside is a mistake, and that's why we must affirm. Just like a bystander, when seeing a bully, the victim is hurt, and afterwards, China has control. China's alleged aid that can probably help Africa is a net loss for the continent when one considers China's trapped debt diplomacy. We will hurt Africa in the long term when we step aside and let China do its colonization for us. And let's move forward with Senator Marwaha when stating that Africa is not hard hit. Africa has been hard hit, unlike Marwaha stated, with 2 beds for 100,000 people in the country of Kenya alone. Making matters worse, low-income African countries are seeing demands for their exports collapse as a result of collapsed economic inactivity within developed nations. And many of them are struggling with high levels of debt, unlike developed countries. The option for borrowing more money is available to richer countries, but not to African countries. So what needs to be done? First, we need to help developing nations and allow them to have a fighting chance against this disease. Moving forward, when Burnside starts talking about how broke the UN is and mentions the WHO organization and how it withdrew, this is a sort of pessimism that the negation champions. The bill funds the United Nations, not the WHO. And plus, Congress is a separate legislative body from the president's foreign policy. We can still provide as much money as needed to the UN to do its work for the world. And moving forward with Representative Hussein, the UN's Ebola response was actually successful in West African countries. We can use the Ebola.
Sorry, Senator, you reached our speaking cap. Now I call upon 2 minutes. 1 minute question. All questions, please rise. Let's see. This will go to Senator Marwaha, followed by Senator Bresson.
So hi, Senator. So in your speech, you said that the negation doesn't want to help these African countries, but haven't we proved that passing today's legislation would be a net harm to these countries?
Okay, so when I start talking about, wait, can you reiterate your question?
Yeah, so what I said is that the negation is proof that passing today's legislation is a net harm. So how are we not helping these African countries?
Okay, so my argument is the fact that if we, this is the part of the argument that I did not get to. So because of the Ebola response being successful, and with just the little money that the United Nations had, just the Ebola is a precedent of that we can use more money to help the African countries more, just like the Ebola response.
Yeah, thank you, Senator.
The Ebola response shows us that we can still provide the necessary monetary and financial aid to African countries.
Senator Bressett.
And we can still help them.
Okay, hi, Senator. So you tell us that if we fail today's legislation, we're going to be letting China do our colonization for us. So can you tell me which the affirmation values more, U.S. hegemony in Africa, or ensuring that we're passing legislation that actually effectively delivers aid
Senator,
to those who need it most?
I apologize for misspeaking. I was just stating the fact that China wants to colonize Africa and not the U.S.
Still, do we value hegemony or do we value effective legislation?
We value both.
Okay, thanks. That's all.
Chair absorbs. And seeing as that was our last speech, I automatically unilaterally move to call for the orders of the day. We'll automatically move into the voting procedures. So all those in favor of passing the legislation B, Africa, please raise your placard. I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 votes for. And those against? Should be 5. Yes, there are 5. Seeing no abstentions, this legislation passes. I applause is in order. And thank you for joining us in our session today. I know we had to fast track the last couple of minutes, but that's completely understandable. So thank you for bearing with us on that. And if you break to finals, good luck. If you don't, you can always watch our live stream. I think it's a great way to improve. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was such a lovely time being your judge. All of you did absolutely stellar. And my critiques are usually my comments are usually a little bit harsher because I focus on where you can improve. But I think you are all absolutely exceptional. You congratulations on making it to semis, and good luck to everyone who's in finals.
Nice job, everyone.
Yeah, great job, everybody. We're all great.
Then you guys can't get promoted further in terms of titles. You guys are already senators, but hopefully you guys will be presidents in the next round. I don't know. Bye.